One founding father, James Wilson, wrote extensively on the impeachment process. Mr. Wilson was a renowned legal scholar at the time, a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He was a major force in drafting and adopting the Constitution in 1787. He served as one of the first six Supreme Court justices, 1789 to 1798. He was appointed by President George Washington. In fact, Wilson taught the first course on the new Constitution to President Washington and his cabinet, the first in the nation's history, in Philadelphia, at the University of Pennsylvania in 1789. Wilson, in his law lectures, the first of their kind under the Constitution, plainly states that the Senate may not ignore the Constitution in impeachment proceedings. He states that lawful and constitutional conduct may not be used as an impeachable offense. Let me say that again. He states that lawful and constitutional conduct may not be used as an impeachable offense. Read along with me. The doctrine of impeachments is of high import in the constitutions of free states. On one hand, the most powerful magistrate should be amenable to the law. On the other hand, elevated characters should not be sacrificed merely on account of their elevation. No one should be secure while he violates the Constitution and the laws. Everyone should be secure while he observes them. To be clear, James Wilson is saying that the Constitution does indeed apply when judging whether to convict an official by impeachment. If the complaint of conduct is constitutional, it cannot be impeachable. Are we to ignore the words and teachings of James Wilson? The House managers surely want you to. The House managers have made several references to this letter, signed by 140 partisan law professors, calling Mr. Trump's First Amendment defense legally frivolous. This is really an outrageous attempt to intimidate Mr. Trump's lawyers. Whenever a lawyer advances a truly frivolous argument, they may violate professional ethical rules and could be subject to discipline. This letter is a direct threat to my law license, my career, and my family's financial well-being. These law professors should be ashamed of themselves, and so should the House managers. How dare you? Do you really hate Donald Trump so much that you're willing to destroy good, hard-working people's lives, people that are only doing their jobs, and frankly, as counsel for an accused fulfilling a constitutional role? It's astounding, really. I'm a citizen, not a politician. I know these First Amendment arguments are not anywhere close to frivolous. They're completely meritorious. Interestingly, the law professor's letter was issued on February 5th, 3 days before we even filed our legal brief in this matter, and they ignored landmark, bedrock Supreme Court cases directly addressing this issue. In our brief, we have a direct quote from James Wilson, the founding father supporting our position. The direct quote was documented in the Founding Fathers' original legal papers. Do I have those with me? On the subject. He was the primary draftsman of the Constitution who taught the new Constitution to President Washington. He says so long as acts of elected officials like Mr. Trump are constitutionally protected, he should not be impeached. We have landmark U.S. Supreme Court decisions, Wood and Bonds, which I'll explain in detail, supporting our position. All of this the House managers and the partisan law professors completely and misleadingly ignore. Frivolous? Hardly. The letter is a bully tactic, and I think evidence is the House managers know they have a problem with the First Amendment defense on the merits, so they're resorting to such tactics. The House manager's suggestion that the First Amendment does not apply to this impeachment process is completely untenable. Ignoring the First Amendment would conflict with the senator's oath of office. It would also conflict with well-settled Supreme Court precedent and ignore the intent of the framers of the Constitution, such as James Wilson. Above all else, ignoring the Constitution would adopt the new Raskin common sense doctrine we heard yesterday, eroding hundreds of years of First Amendment protections. We are here under the Constitution. It is illogical what the House managers say. The Constitution does apply to this constitutional impeachment process. It's double talk, nonsense, illogical. If the House managers had their way, they would ignore all of the Constitution. Does that include the Sixth Amendment? The right to counsel? They would have Mr. Trump sitting here without lawyers. And who would be next? It could be anyone. One of you or one of you. You must reject this invitation to ignore the First Amendment. It is anti-American and would set dangerous precedent forever. The law has developed over the years to clearly establish elected officials have the right to engage in protected speech. Mr. Trump is not just a guy on the street or a guy at a bar or a fire chief or a police officer. There were a few of them in there. All analogies given by the House managers. These sideways analogies are wrong. Mr. Trump was an elected official, and there is an entire body of law, Supreme Court landmark cases supporting the conclusion that Mr. Trump actually has enhanced free speech rights because he is an elected official. These cases are ignored by the House managers and the law professors. And that, too, is total intellectual dishonesty. The Supreme Court has long held that the First Amendment's right to freedom of speech protects elected officials. Two important on-point decisions from the Supreme Court, Wood versus Georgia and Bond versus Floyd, expressly contradict the House managers' position. The House managers do not even cite those cases in their brief. They barely acknowledged them in their reply, and they were mum on them yesterday. In Wood versus Georgia, the Supreme Court addressed a case involving a sitting sheriff whose reelection was being investigated by a grand jury impaneled by a judge based on allegations of irregular Negro bloc voting. It was in the 60s. The sheriff spoke publicly in multiple press releases calling the grand jury investigations racist, illegitimate, and an attempt to intimidate voters. He even urged the grand jurors on how to decide the issues and not let its high office be a party to any political attempt to intimidate voters. The sheriff viewed the grand jury as challenging the legitimacy of his election. The sheriff even sent a letter to the grand jurors with these allegations, which is an extraordinary step since laws in most states, including Georgia, prohibit attempts to influence or intimidate jurors. The sheriff was charged and convicted of contempt of court and obstruction of the grand jury. But the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Brennan, reversed. The court held that the First Amendment protected an elected public official's speech because the voting controversy directly affected the sheriff's political career. G29. The petitioner was an elected official and had, read with me, please, everybody. The petitioner was an elected official and had the right to enter the field of political controversy, particularly where his political life was at stake. The role that elected officials play in our society makes it all the more imperative that they be allowed freely to express themselves on matters of current public importance. Would, thus, stands for the proposition that a difference of political opinion expressed in the speech on an issue of voting irregularity cannot be punishable where all that was done was to encourage investigation and peaceful political speech. Just like Mr. Trump has done here. The legal scholars call that directly on point. A second case, Bond versus Floyd, involved a state legislature punishing an elected official for protected political speech. Bond is particularly instructive here, too. In Bond, the Supreme Court squarely addressed the question of an elected official's punishment by a legislature for statements alleged to have incited public violation of the law, the burning of draft cards. The court unequivocally rejected the idea, advanced here by the House managers, that an elected official is entitled to no protection under the First Amendment. The Supreme Court held that the Georgia House of Representatives was, in fact, forbidden by the First Amendment from punishing Bond, by not seating him, for advocating against the policy of the United States. There are three fundamental holdings in Bond. One, the manifest function of the First Amendment in a representative government requires that legislators be given the widest latitude to express their views on issues of policy. Two, just as erroneous statements must be protected to give freedom of expression the breathing space it needs to survive, so statements criticizing public policy and the implementation of it must be similarly protected. Third holding, legislators have an obligation to take positions on controversial political questions so that their constituents can be fully informed by them and be better able to assess their qualifications. Please read along with me. Their qualifications for office. Also, so they may be represented in governmental debates by the person they have elected to represent them. Mr. Trump enjoys this same First Amendment protection from Congress. The First Amendment's protections guarantee free speech addressing the electoral integrity issues essential to his career that Mr. Trump has consistently advocated. The House managers argue that the First Amendment, and I quote, does not shield public officials who occupy sensitive policy-making positions from adverse actions when their speech undermines important governmental interests. That is flat wrong. They are, in essence, attempting to treat Mr. Trump as their employee. This is not the law under Wood and Bond. Mr. Trump was elected by the people. He is an elected official. The Supreme Court says elected officials must have the right to freely engage in public speech. Indeed, the Supreme Court expressly rejected the House manager's argument in Wood versus Georgia, holding that the sheriff was not a civil servant, but an elected official who had core First Amendment rights which could not be restricted. That's Wood v. Georgia, page 395, footnote 21. The House managers do not mention Wood or Bond in the trial brief or anywhere else. Why? Why not? Because it does not fit their narrative or their story. They want to punish Mr. Trump for engaging in constitutionally protected free speech, and they do not want you to consider the issue. But you must. Question 2. Does Mr. Trump's speech deserve protection under the First Amendment? There is no doubt Mr. Trump engaged in constitutionally protected political speech that the House has improperly characterized as incitement of insurrection. The fatal flaw of the House's argument is that it seeks to mete out governmental punishment, impeachment, based on First Amendment political speech. Speech for political purposes is the kind of activity to which the First Amendment offers its strongest protection. These are bedrock principles recognized by our Supreme Court for decades. The court has stated in no uncertain terms the importance of these principles to our democratic principles. The general proposition that freedom of expression upon public questions is secured by the First Amendment has long been settled by our decisions. The constitutional safeguard, we have said, was fashioned to assure unfettered interchange of ideas for the bringing about of political and social changes desired by the people. New York Times v. Sullivan. Our First Amendment decisions have created a rough hierarchy in the constitutional protection of speech. Core political speeches occupy the highest, most protected position. Even political speech that may incite unlawful conduct is protected from the reach of government punishment. The court has said every idea is an incitement, and if speech may be suppressed when it might inspire someone to act unlawfully, then there is no limit to the state's censorial power. The government may not prohibit speech because it increases the chances of an unlawful act will be committed at some indefinite time in the future. The House managers showed you a series of tweets going all the way back to 2015 in an effort to prove incitement. All of that evidence is totally irrelevant under the constitutional definition of incitement. Brandenburg versus Ohio is really the landmark case on the issue of incitement speech. Half of the case was mentioned yesterday. In the Brandenburg v. Ohio case, another landmark, the court held the government may only suppress speech for advocating the use of force or a violation of law if such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. The Brandenburg holding has been interpreted as having three basic prongs to determine if speech meet the definition of incitement. The Brandenburg test precludes speech from being sanctioned as incitement to a riot unless the speech explicitly or implicitly encouraged use of violence or lawless action. 2, the speaker intends that his speech will result in use of violence or lawless action. And 3, the imminent use of violence or lawless action is the likely result of the speech. The House managers cannot get past the first prong of the Brandenburg test. They have not and cannot prove Mr. Trump explicitly or implicitly encouraged use of violence or lawless action, period. Brandenburg requires a close examination of the words themselves. The words are either important or they're not. The House managers admitted that the incitement issue is not about the words. Why not? Because on the face of it, Mr. Trump's words are no different than the figurative speech used by every one of the senators assembled here today. If it is not about the words, but about the big lie of a stolen election, then why isn't House Manager Raskin guilty since he tried to overturn the 2016 election? The more the House managers speak, the more hypocrisy gets revealed. Hypocrisy. Even though they say it's not about the words, the law under Brandenburg requires a close analysis of the words to determine incitement. So we need to look at those words. Mr. Trump did the opposite of advocating for lawless action, the opposite. He expressly advocated for peaceful action at the Save America rally. He explicitly stated, these are the words, "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." To peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. That is how this president has spoken for years when he condemns violence, lawlessness, and rioters. The House managers have played manipulated, selectively edited parts of Mr. Trump's speech. They focus heavily on the word fight. The president used the word fight 20 times in his speech. They picked only 2. Why? Why not the other 18? Because they don't tell the story the way they want to tell it. Here are all of them. Listen to the context.
And Rudy, you did a great job. He's got guts. You know what? He's got guts. Unlike a lot of people in the Republican Party, he's got guts. He fights. He fights. And I'll tell you, thank you very much, John. Fantastic job. I watched. That's a tough act to follow, those two. There's so many weak Republicans, and we have great ones. Jim Jordan and some of these guys, they're out there fighting. The House guys are fighting. But it's incredible. Many of the Republicans, I helped them get in. I helped them get elected. Get rid of, how do you say, I want to get rid of America first? Even if you're going to do it, don't talk about it, right? Unbelievable what we have to go through. What we have to go through, and you have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them. We're gonna let you know who they are. I could already tell you, frankly. Republicans are constantly fighting like a boxer with his hands tied behind his back. It's like a boxer. And we want to be so nice. We want to be so respectful of everybody, including bad people. And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, That will be a sad day for our country, because you're sworn to uphold our Constitution. And the accountability says, if we see somebody in there that doesn't treat our vets well, or they steal, they rob, they do things badly, we say, Joe, you're fired. Get out of here. Before, you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that before. So we've taken care of things. We've done things like nobody's ever thought possible. And that's part of the reason that many people don't like us, because we've done too much. But we've done it quickly, and we were going to sit home and watch a big victory, and everybody had us down for a victory. It was going to be great. And now we're out here fighting. I said to somebody I was going to take a few days and relax after our big electoral victory. 10 o'clock, it was over. The American people do not believe the corrupt fake news anymore. They have ruined their reputation. But, you know, it used to be that they'd argue with me. I'd fight. So I'd fight, they'd fight, I'd fight, they'd fight. Boop, boop. You'd believe me, you'd believe them. Somebody comes out, you know. They had their point of view, I had my point of view. But you'd have an argument. Now what they do is they go silent. It's called suppression. And that's what happens in a communist country. That's what they do. They suppress. You don't fight with them anymore unless it's a bad story. If they have a little bad story about me, they make it 10 times worse, and it's a major headline. But Hunter Biden, they don't talk about him. What happened to Hunter? Where's Hunter? With your help over the last 4 years, we built the greatest political movement in the history of our country, and nobody even challenges that. I say that over and over, and I never get challenged by the fake news, and they challenge almost everything we say. But our fight against the big donors, big media, big tech, and others is just getting started. This is the greatest in history. There's never been a movement like that. Our brightest days are before us. Our greatest achievements still wait. I think one of our great achievements will be election security, because nobody until I came along had any idea how corrupt our elections were. And again, most people would stand there at 9 o'clock in the evening and say, I want to thank you very much. And they go off to some other life. But I said, something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. Can't have happened. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Our exciting adventures and boldest endeavors have not yet begun. My fellow Americans, for our movement, for our children, and for our beloved country. And I say this, despite all that's happened, the best is yet to come.
A boxer fighting with his hand tied behind his back, members of Congress fighting, Rudy being Rudy. These are the metaphorical, rhetorical uses of the word fight. We all know that, right? Suddenly, the word fight is off limits. Spare us the hypocrisy and false indignation. It's a term used over and over and over again by politicians on both sides of the aisle. And of course, the Democrat House managers know that the word fight has been used figuratively in political speech forever. But don't take it from me. It's best to listen to them.
Our mission is to fight.
Our job is to fight.
We are in a fight. We are in a fight. We are in a fight.
Democrats are fighting as hard as we can.
Democrats are standing up to fight.
We know how to fight. We like a good fight.
Democrats are going to fight like hell.
We fight like hell.
I'm going to fight like hell.
I will fight like hell.
We're going to fight like hell.
I'm going to fight like hell.
Fight like hell.
I will fight like hell.
We have to fight like hell.
I know many other senators and members of the House will fight like hell.
We are going to fight like hell.
We're going to fight like hell.
We'll fight like hell.
And we just have to fight.
We're going to fight. We are going to fight. We're going to fight. We're going to fight.
Because you'll fight.
To fight.
Political revolution. That means that millions have got to stand up and fight.
And fight and fight. Stand up and fight back.
To fight. And continue to fight. And once again, fight back in the fight.
We're fighting back.
My fight to fight an administration.
You don't get what you don't fight for.
We'll also fight him and challenge him in every way that we can.
Fight in Congress, fight in the courts, fight in the streets.
In the Congress, in the courts, and in the streets.
There's the fight, there's the fight, there's the fight, and then there's the fight to defend.
We're eager to take on this fight.
The American people are going to have to fight.
Get in this fight. Get in this fight.
Around the clock fighting. We've got to keep fighting and keep focused.
We will fight when we must fight. We've been fighting, so we need to fight, but we also need to fight.
It's always going to be an uphill fight.
This is going to be a fight. We always must fight.
We're in the fight of our lives.
And we're going to be in for the fight of our lives.
This is the fight of our life.
The fight of their lives.
We are in this fight for our lives.
We cannot ever give up fighting.
Hypocrisy. The reality is Mr. Trump was not in any way, shape, or form instructing these people to fight or to use physical violence. What he was instructing them to do was to challenge their opponents in primary elections, to push for sweeping election reforms, to hold big tech responsible, all customary and legal ways to petition your government for redress of grievances, which of course is also protected constitutional speech. But the House managers don't want you to focus on those things because, again, it does not fit their story. In the end, I leave you with this quote from Benjamin Franklin. Freedom of speech is a principal pillar of a free government. When this support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved and tyranny is erected on its ruins. Thank you.
Mr. President,
The majority leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess for a 15-minute break.
The objection.
And thus concludes the first portion of the former president's attorney's case. Let's bring in Nancy Cordes. And Nancy, it was a lot of video.
It was, and we saw some of the same clips over and over again as it appeared that the primary argument that the defense wanted to make here is that many politicians use the word fight or fight like hell when they are talking about things that they care about, just as President Trump was on that day, on January 6th. They tried to compress the impeachment manager's case down to just one speech, that January 6th speech that the president made just before his supporters peeled off and headed to the Capitol. The problem is that the case that the managers made was actually much bigger than that one day. What they were arguing was that the president ginned up his supporters over the course of months, using more than just the word fight. He told them that the election had been stolen from him and from them, and embraced a wide-ranging conspiracy theory about all the people who had been involved in taking the election away from them. But today, the defense attorneys focused on his language on January 6th. They argued that he did call for peaceful protest at one point. They said he had every right to say it because he has a First Amendment right, just like anyone else does. And they argued that he was being taken out of context. But then, unfortunately, they played a lot of clips from other politicians in which they were taken out of context as well.
And from some of our reports inside the gallery, some of the Democratic senators during that 11-minute video, they were laughing, they were shaking their heads, they were whispering to one another, passing notes to one another. And the strategy by Trump's lawyers today was to make sure they don't lose any Republicans. Did they succeed?
Probably. I can imagine a lot of Republicans looking at that and saying, yes, Democrats have done things and they didn't say what they ought to have said from my political point of view during the unrest this summer, and they contributed, if not to lots of protests, maybe some violence in the streets over the George Floyd and racial justice issues. Republicans talk about that all the time. But there's one component part of this that I think Trump supporters will find unsettling, which is when the president said peacefully and patriotically protest, that's the only thing he meant. He didn't mean fight. He didn't mean to stop the steal. He didn't mean go to the Capitol to do anything. And many Trump supporters who gathered here thought that's exactly what they were supposed to do. So the core argument here is, you Trump supporters, you misread the president. He didn't want you to fight. He wanted you to kind of be weak and passive and accept this. And Trump supporters didn't come to Washington on that basis. They believed that a steal was afoot, even though it wasn't, and that they had to do something to stop it. And going to the Capitol was the remedy or the means by which to stop it. Remember, there was nothing happening at the Capitol. There were no more additional speeches. There were no events there. The only event going on at the Capitol at that time, as they marched from the ellipse, was the process by which to verify the certified electoral votes. Well, if you weren't going there to stop it, what were you going there to do? And the president said many times, go to the Capitol. Well, now the president's defense attorneys say he really didn't mean any of that. And you Trump supporters misinterpreted him entirely and carried out acts of criminality. Well, that's putting a great arm distance relationship between the president and his followers. I think many Trump supporters will find that unsettling, to say the least.
Let's bring in our legal expert, Jeffrey Rosen. He's a constitutional law school scholar and the president of the National Constitution Center. And Jeffrey, I'm so glad you're with us because the defense team cited a number of Supreme Court cases to try to argue that the president was within his First Amendment rights here. Were those cases relevant?
They were not convincing. One of the major cases was called Wood v. Georgia. It comes from 1972. It involves a Georgia sheriff who denounces grand jury proceedings that are investigating allegations of violations of voting rights. And basically, the Supreme Court said that holding the sheriff in contempt violated his free speech rights because denouncing the court was within his rights. But that was about a contempt order that would have imprisoned him. It had nothing to do with impeachment. President Trump obviously has free speech rights, and that means he can't be criminally prosecuted for his protected speech. But it doesn't mean that he can't be impeached for inciting the violent attack on the Capitol. So essentially, this is part of an effort to apply a series of cases that protect free speech rights of public officials in other contexts to an impeachment proceedings. And as you were just discussing, none of it really engages the central claim that far from being protected speech, President Trump's incitement was actually unprotected and potentially criminal and certainly impeachable.
What did you think was the strongest part of their argument?
Well, I think the strongest part would be that if this were a criminal trial, it's not a slam dunk about whether or not President Trump's speech would be protected. If you simply focus on the January 6th statement, as they did, if you only focus on that speech at the ellipse, and you emphasize that he said things should be peaceful, if I were arguing this before a criminal jury, I might hope that some of them might be persuaded to hold that it wasn't directed to and likely to incite imminent violence. So really, the strongest defense is to say you can only impeach if the conduct is, unprotected by the First Amendment, and this was protected by the First Amendment. It doesn't engage any of the defense's broader arguments, but that would be their best bet, and they tried to do that today.
Yeah, Michael Vanderveen saying just that impeachment poses a serious threat to freedom of speech for political leaders of both parties. And I think part of why they tried to show that montage of video, 11 minutes long, of Democrats saying they would fight, fight, fight. What they left out of that, of course, is that they were talking about for veterans, for health care, for other Democratic priorities. Major, was it misleading, that video?
Parts of it were misleading, for sure. And of course, the rhetoric, I think we could all agree, in Washington has, over the last 2 decades, become more intense, more pugilistic, more metaphorically aggressive. That's certainly true. If anyone was the best person at that, the most aggressive, the most pugilistic, it's not even close. It's Donald Trump. And he's proud of that. He doesn't shy away from that, nor do his supporters. One of the other things I think that was misleading, though, was the other video about those previous attempts that Democrats had made in the process to challenge previous elections and the registering of electoral votes. The key distinction there is, in all of those cases, the nominee of their party never endorsed that, ever, and always conceded. That was true of John Kerry in 2005. It was true of Hillary Clinton in 2016 and 2017. It was true once the Supreme Court ruled in Bush v. Gore for Al Gore in 2001. At no point did the nominee in question back up these efforts to raise questions on the floor of the House during the ultimate counting of the certified electoral votes. But this time, the nominee, in this case the President of the United States, did, and said over and over the election had been stolen, and when given an opportunity to prove that in court, lost not once, but more than 60 times. That is a key distinction, and that, I think, was the biggest deception laid before the Senate impeachment trial today.
It's an excellent point about, because certainly the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, had given that speech, said the president should pursue all legal avenues, and in fact, they pursued as many as they could. Dozens and dozens of cases, more than 60, as you point out, and in none of those cases did the judges suggest that the electoral vote count or that there was fraud involved, which was at the heart of many of the allegations. Let's bring in CBS's congressional correspondent, Nicole Killian. She's up on Capitol Hill. Nicole, they're taking a break right now for about 10 minutes. It could stretch longer. What happens next?
Well, what happens next is we will hear more from the former president's defense team, and once they wrap up, we expect that we will move into a question and answer phase that will span a couple of hours as well. But I also want to give you some reaction from the House impeachment managers team as far as some of the claims that were made in that video presentation, and they're basically blasting this as a gimmick and a parlor game meant to inflame tensions. And one impeachment aide pointed back to what Congressman David Cicilline, one of the impeachment managers, said earlier in the week, where he noted that the former president is not being impeached because of his words. In essence, it's because, he sought to overturn the election and that he did not defend the Capitol, and in doing so, incited armed violence against us, in Cicilline's words. So that is their response to that. Also, they're responding to some of the accusations about these selectively altered tweets. And so, again, an aide on the impeachment team points out to the fact that, for instance, because the former president's Twitter account no longer exists, they can't go back and get these screenshots. Instead, they have to go back to archives. And so, we saw a picture, for instance, of the lead impeachment manager looking at these tweets side by side, and you heard from the president's counsel that, perhaps they altered these images. But again, the impeachment team saying that that was not the case. They had to pull from archives, and that the substance of those tweets were accurate, and pretty much reaffirmed their case that the former president was aware that, things were being planned. Nora?
Nicole Killian, thank you. Also with us is Ed O'Keefe. And Ed, if you look at the Trump lawyers' presentation, many of his supporters will cheer them on for the video that they play. Some other people say, yeah, it was a legitimate argument about due process that they made. Look, Democrats say fight like hell, too. Or was it grasping at straws?
It probably depends on who you're asking, but I think this I know what I am, what are you argument certainly plays well to the television audience who's watching at home. And I think they realize that if there's no sign of a conviction, they at least should take advantage of a few of the hours they have here with a captive audience and try to make a point. And the point is that everybody does this to some extent, that the rhetoric's hot. The big difference, of course, is as Major said, no other political candidate was out there actively encouraging their supporters to try to upend the results of a legitimate election. The other thing I think watching this, especially given that there were several prominent clips of the Vice President, Harris, in many ways, this may be seen as the opening salvo of the 2024 presidential campaign. Whether or not Donald Trump is part of it, they certainly use those video clips to try to sully the image of the public perception of the vice president, to some extent the president, and of course several other prominent Democratic senators, some of the bigger liberal stars. But the use of the vice president, I think, and some of the selected ones they put there especially. And we saw again something that Republicans do far too often.
And how does that, and let me ask you on that, how does that sully the image of the now vice president by using clips of her saying that she wants to fight for policies that she thinks are important?
Because we didn't see the full clip, for one thing. So it's going to sully her image potentially in the eyes of people who don't already like her or may be skeptical of her being involved. But they were certainly taken out of context. There's no doubt about that. I just think the other thing that they continue to do here today that gets done far too often in the conservative press and on the floor of the House and the Senate is they were mispronouncing the names of certain Democratic lawmakers, mostly women. They can claim that they don't know how to do it, but a lot of that is done on purpose, again, to try to discredit them in the eyes of certain voters.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring back in Nancy Cordes. And Nancy, do you think that this persuaded or gave cover to some of those Republican senators who were looking for just that?
Well, I think that there was an interesting strategy here to call out a number of the jurors, the Senate Democrats in the room in these videos. It's interesting because it's something that the House impeachment managers scrupulously avoided in their 2 days of presentations. There were a lot of points where they could have brought in clips of Senate Republicans either embracing the president's call to overturn the election, supporting him, or calling him out after the fact. They were very careful to avoid that because they knew they couldn't alienate those Senate Republicans. They want them on board at the end of the day. That was not the case today. They played, dozens of clips of Elizabeth Warren alone, senator from Massachusetts. And that's part of the reason that there was a lot of laughing there on the Senate floor as Republicans and Democrats alike kind of looked at each other in a bemused fashion. Just to add to what Ed was saying a moment ago when it comes to Kamala Harris, that was one of the most misleading clips that was played because they aired her saying, "Everyone beware, they are not going to stop." And they implied that this was something that she said about rioters last summer as they tried to argue that, look, it's Democrats who promote violence. It's not the president. But when you look at the full clip, she was talking about peaceful protesters. She was not talking about rioters. She was not talking about violence at all. And so that's the kind of thing that, can turn off a jury pool if you're not careful. But in this case, because this is not a court of law, this is a group of politicians who are making a political decision here. Yes, to answer your question, I do think that they are giving Senate Republicans the cover they need to argue that he never explicitly called for violence. He never explicitly on January 6th or at any other time said to his supporters, "I want you to go and foment violence at the Capitol. I want you to storm the building. I want you to break windows and doors, and I want you to get in there any way you can, and I want you to beat up police officers, and I want you to try to get at the vice president." No, he never explicitly said that. And so if that's what Senate Republicans need in order to decide that there was no incitement of insurrection here, then these lawyers most likely have succeeded at that.
It's worth mentioning, though, the great thing that's absent. There is no discussion so far, and I don't anticipate there will be one, that the president was right that the election was stolen. Nothing. Exactly. Nothing on that at all. No part of this defense suggests that the president was onto something or that he has every reason or still had reasons to repeat these things. They talk about he was pursuing his legal options, but they don't finish that sentence or finish the story. Having pursued them and being defeated over and over and over again by even Trump-appointed judges, the president did not stop. He continued a relentless argumentation that the election had been stolen from him. His attorneys are not making that case at all, not one shred of it. But there is one component part of this, to Ed's point about the larger political atmosphere here, that I think is relevant. Look, House Republicans won a lot of seats in a surprising fashion. One of the reasons is they didn't talk about Trump policies or Trumpism, but they talked about the summer of unrest and they talked about defunding police. And that is a legitimate, real issue. And part of this conversation today had nothing to do with the impeachment trial because they know the president's going to be acquitted anyway, but making this other point. Democrats did not, in the summertime, say enough things to question or scrutinize the violence that was part of the overall protest culture. And they should have. And that question was tested in the elections. And in many cases, Democrats lost because they failed that test.
And they admitted
that is not irrelevant to this conversation.
And they admitted it later
Yes.
by telling civil rights organizations we need to not talk about this or allow this to get discussed.
And I don't think it's
elections.
a coincidence that it was part of today's presentation because yesterday was very tough for the president and the Law and Order Republican Party to see what Capitol Police, Metropolitan Police encountered on that fateful day of January 6th. And David Cicilline saying yesterday, so much for backing the blue. So there had to be an effort today to sort of recast this conversation. And I think that has nothing to do actually with the facts or the underlying legal questions in the impeachment trial, but it does have a larger political purpose.
Yeah.
Can I ask all of you, too, about, I mean, the Trump lawyers were in the beginning, and Mr. Schoen was trying to make the case that the Democrats had doctored some of the evidence. Address that claim by them.
Well, in that case, it was that he was using the specific example of a tweet that was on the screen. And I think, as we heard Nicole say a little while ago, while they were compiling their evidence in the last few weeks, his Twitter account disappeared. So they may have been trying. We don't know yet, and it's actually
meaning Trump's Twitter account. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it merits follow up with the impeachment managers. But what they were trying to infer is that they may have been trying to doctor them for some reason in advance.
And
again, it's all process. It's all designed to discredit this entire affair.
Right. The only other example they gave was a retweet of the president's that was put up on the screen during the House impeachment manager's presentation over the last couple of days, where they claimed that he had retweeted one person with a blue check mark, which means that they are, an established figure, well known. But instead it was actually a tweet from someone else with the same name but without a blue check mark. And, they claimed that this was an indication that the House impeachment managers were trying somehow to indicate that the president I actually don't know what the point was that they were making, but it turns out it was a mistake, and the House impeachment team has said that they made a mistake and they put in the wrong person, but that there was no nefarious. They put up hundreds of tweets over the course of 2 days.
Right. The reason I ask that is because I wonder whether it feeds a narrative of those who support former President Trump. Oh, yes. Look. Those managers, they doctored the evidence. Yeah. They didn't engage in due process. Right. Oh, look, the Democrats use that same language, fight like hell. You can see all of this showing up on television tonight by some of the former president's supporters.
Absolutely. And they will say the media is piling on Donald Trump, never piles on the Democrats. Trust me, I've spent 5 years in the Trumpian world, covering the president, the campaign, and I know a lot of Trump supporters, been to many rallies. That is a long-standing, deeply held grievance. That President Trump is kicked all the time, relentlessly, never given a fair shot, and always the worst is assumed about the president. And one of the things that they asserted, the president's lawyers, is that the media never showed the president's full remarks about Charlottesville when he gave that press conference in the basement of Trump Tower. Well, we covered it live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Point one. Point two. The country itself, reading the president's rhetoric immediately after Charlottesville, came to a conclusion that, yes, there were moments when he said, I condemn these certain things. But he also allowed plenty of room for interpretation about what he wasn't condemning. Mm-hmm. And that is what the country itself basically came to a conclusion about. That, yes, the president said that violence was wrong. But he rarely, if ever, specifically condemned those who started it, those who were there to foment it, and those who were most violent in expressing it. And always found a way to say that the leftist violence was either just as bad or quite possibly worse or even more menacing, tilting his orientation to what the real danger in America is from the right to the left. And that's something the country has observed and pretty much made up its mind about. And when you ask that question in the exit polls of the 2020 election on race and issues like this, the country had made a conclusion, all except Trump supporters, that in the main, the president was not as sensitive to these issues, and he was much more forgiving of the right and disproportionately condemning of the left. And that, I think, is where this stands. And the allegation that it's unfair has already been digested and at least voted upon once in a national election.
Was it surprising to any of you to see them bring up Charlottesville again?
Sure, because in the Republican circles, that is a thing. You never give the president credit. He said those things. You see, he condemned it. And because the allegation goes, the media doesn't focus on those condemning words, it's unjust, it's unfair to President Trump, and doesn't give the full context. So they do want to go back to that. They absolutely want to refight that battle. Also, they want to refight it on very core cultural dimensions. Right. It's no accident that they included the part where the president said they were protecting Robert E. Lee. And they're trying to erase our history, and they're trying to erase our culture. Trust me, that's not coincidental showing up in an impeachment trial. That's not about that at all. That is about this larger political message and this larger sense that there is a gap in America between those who want to protect, as the Trump world describes it, America that was, and as the Biden-Harris, it is alleged, campaign, now administration, want to create a new culture for America. And that dividing line is very important, not only for Trump supporters, but in this case, for political reasons, his defense team.
And as early as next year's congressional elections.
In fact, Trump's attorney, Michael Vanderveen, said this trial is a constitutional cancel culture. One other thing we haven't had the chance to talk about yet is the former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, and UN ambassador, has given an interview saying of former President Trump, we shouldn't have followed him. You know, she's been an ally of his. What does this indicate about the future direction of the Republican Party?
I think it indicates that she is telling other Republicans, you can say this and not only breathe, but have a political life ahead of you. And she has been reluctant to do this, as the article goes through great pains to show. She was with the president, not only through the administration, with the president in the immediate aftermath of the election, questioning election results, even though she knew in her heart he was wrong, and saying, well, he believes in it because he believes it, therefore it's valid. So she was walking down this path with the president for a very long time.
Until January 6th.
Right, until breaking now. This is a break point, and Nikki Haley is saying, much as Liz Cheney has said, this is a break point. It cannot be defended. You cannot bridge this gap. This is a dividing line in the party, and I'm on the other side of it now.
And I think it's interesting, Nora, because what we've observed on Capitol Hill over the past 4 years is House and Senate Republicans telling reporters privately, well, we've got to stick with him this one more time because we need X. We need him on our side for the next COVID relief bill, or we need him to not be mad at us because we need his help in Georgia. So we can't break with him now. We have to pretend that we agree with him, that the election was stolen because we need to pacify him. You know, you and I know that we don't actually believe this, but publicly we're going to have to stand by him. And so I think the message is, it's going to hurt. At some point, you've got to rip the Band-Aid off. At some point, you have to stand up and say, publicly, I don't agree with him, and I'm going to create some distance, and it's going to hurt no matter when you do it. But if you don't, the longer this goes on, the more difficult it gets.
And there's a very interesting quote in here, Nora, where because the argument, of course, that a lot of Republicans have been going through is, do we need to go back to the way we were? Do we embrace what we are right now and continue building upon it? She's arguing for a third way. Nor do I think the Republican Party is going to go back to the way it was before Trump. I don't think it should. I think what we need to do is take the good that he built, leave the bad that he did, and get back to a place where we can be a good, valuable, effective party. This is her declaration of candidacy in 2024 and her argument that there is potentially a third way through this for the Republican Party over the next 3 years as they prepare for that next election.
And I find it fascinating that the two most aggressive voices along this line are women.
Yeah. And that's no mistake.
Liz Cheney and Nikki Haley.
Because Republican women understand. Elise Stefanik is another one, although she's been slightly more aligned with the president over the past year. But she had been one of those saying that the only way to get back to being a majority party is to, be much more effective in selling what we are to women, to the suburban voters we've lost, to minorities. And that's what's troubling to so many today watching this presentation by the president's defense team, because it's reviving a lot of that stuff, mispronouncing names, focusing on primarily the words of female and minority and Jewish Democratic members. That's been noticed, and they're doing it again, is what many people are suggesting by watching this again today.
Yeah, Congresswoman Stefanik has taken her car and attached it to the Trump train, no doubt.
Yes.
But I want to ask, Major, because you pointed that out about the two leading Republican women in the party, Liz Cheney and Nikki Haley.
Now Nikki Haley,
of them with their, yes. Although Liz Cheney, I think, was a little bit tougher than Nikki Haley. I wonder, do you think that's a political calculation or a moral calculation?
It can be both. It's also a survival calculation. I don't believe they either believe that this party can survive and can win in swing districts or win in tough swing states or win nationally if you keep the toxicity of Trump. They fundamentally don't believe that. And when Liz Cheney says this was an abandonment of the Constitution, she means it. And when Nikki Haley said we were wrong to follow Trump, she means it. And yes, Liz Cheney's tougher than Nikki Haley, but Nora, as you well know, everyone in Washington watches any separation at all from Trump, either as president or former president, for any sign that there's a break. And now two are breaking, and they're breaking with some discernible and definable difference between him. And they're saying this is possible, and I'm going to show a way, maybe not the way, but a way to separate yourself.
I think also if you look at it politically, cynically, it's going to be a crowded field in 2024, and everybody's looking for their lanes. And clearly, Josh Hawley of Missouri and Ted Cruz of Texas have decided that this is still going to be the party of Trump in 2024. So they're going to hitch their wagon to him. Nikki Haley, potentially Liz Cheney, are making a bet that the party's going to want to shake off Donald Trump in 2024. So they're going to carve out that lane now, and they'll be the pioneers. And if they've made the right bet, then that'll be a successful political strategy for them, at least in the primaries. If they've made the wrong bet, then they may regret it. The challenge for the rest of Senate and House Republicans who aren't running for president is that what these two women are arguing to them is short-term pain for long-term gain. It's going to hurt now to disassociate yourself from the former president, but you have to do it for the long-term survival of the party. The problem is that politicians are not great at thinking, setting aside their short-term political needs in favor of long-term.
The good ones are.
Especially members.
The good ones are.
Especially members of the House.
I'm serious. The good politicians are actually capable of doing that. And that's how they survive, and that's how they redirect, and that's how they move things. And Nikki Haley and Liz Cheney are telling Republicans this is a moment of choosing.
Stand by. We've got congressional correspondent Nicole Killian with us. And Nicole, I understand you've got some reporting from some of those impeachment managers who were watching the defense presentation.
Yeah, that's right. Well, their team has some additional reaction again to some of these charges of doctored video. And you'll recall during a portion of the trial, actually several times during the trial, we saw the former president's defense team put up video from his rally on January 6th when he was talking about, I'm going to go down to the Capitol with you. And so the former president's team said, but, you know, this is where the video stops. They didn't show you the rest of what he said. Well, now the impeachment manager's team is saying, well, actually, yes, we did. And so they're pointing back to when Congresswoman Dean actually showed some clips of the same portion of the speech where she showed, for instance, a section where the former president says, you know, I'm going to walk down to the Capitol with you. You know, we're going to cheer on our senators. And then they say that she showed another clip where the former president, again, made this reference to going down to the Capitol, adding that, you know, we will do this peacefully and patriotically, which the defense team contends is what the impeachment managers left out. So, in fact, they are now arguing that the defense was incorrect.
I wonder, too, there is one other argument that those impeachment managers could make, which is that in none of those multitude of clips in which Democrats use the word fight, even fight like hell, fight to the end, in none of those exhortations by Democrats did it lead to an insurrection on Capitol Hill. And again, it was the president's words, and only the president's words, that led to an insurrection and something that hasn't happened in hundreds of years.
And again, that is their point. And we heard over the course of these last 2 days that, you know, that is why this case is different. That is why these senators have to hold the former president accountable, because despite how many times you say the word fight, it did not lead to the event of January 6th. On the flip side, you heard from the former president's attorneys say, but look, we have to protect speech on all sides. Look at how many times the word fight was used, you know, from all of these different lawmakers, and the rhetoric on both sides has been inflammatory. And so we can't set this precedent of, you know, punishing people who say the words fight figuratively. So that is the debate that we are witnessing right now.
Yeah, I want to bring, thank you so much, Nicole Killian. I also want to bring back in Jeffrey Rosen before we return to the defense presentation, because Mr. Schoen, one of the defense attorneys there, said that, you know, the House managers didn't give President Trump due process, that there wasn't time to verify the facts. Does that undercut their prosecution at all?
No, in the sense that due process rights, like the rules of hearsay, don't apply in an impeachment trial. An impeachment trial is completely defined by the Senate, which has complete power to structure it in any way it likes, short of flipping a coin for the result. The Supreme Court has said any process that the Senate decides to afford is all that the defendant is due. So it's not a legal argument in any sense, or even a constitutional one. All they can do is appeal to the senator's sense of fairness. We didn't really get a chance for the president to make his case. Well, that doesn't obviate the need for them to actually make the case now or argue that stuff was unconvincing. And that's why claims that hearsay was involved, for example, also are not really persuasive, because the rules of hearsay don't apply in this trial either. Essentially, they're going to have to cast doubt on the evidence itself. And that's what they're trying to do, of course, by claiming doctored videos and so forth. But it may not ultimately prove to be entirely convincing.
And that's why I asked you that question, because the argument they're making is the former president was denied his due process rights. He's being treated so unfairly here. Democrats have said the same thing. Was it more what you heard, more of a political argument than a legal argument to specifically rebut some of the legal arguments that the impeachment managers made? You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I think that's exactly right. To the degree they're making a due process argument, they're really making a political argument. Hey, this wasn't fair. This was rushed. The president didn't have a chance to put on his case. There wasn't a full investigation of the facts. Look, the Democrats did it too. Those are political arguments. They're appealing to the court of public opinion. But remember, Manager Raskin did the same thing yesterday. He quoted Thomas Paine and common sense. He said, we all have common sense. We know what we saw. We experienced it. We were here. Who are you going to believe? Your eyes or what they're telling you. So if it comes down to the political question of, is there really a fair chance to claim that the president didn't incite the violence, or that we didn't experience that violence here, the senators are perfectly capable of making up their own minds.
Jeffrey Rosen, thank you. We are now approaching what are going to be the closing arguments made by former President Trump's defense team, and then begins this period where senators can ask questions. And I think this is going to be kind of the interesting point. And Nancy, walk us through how exactly it works.
So there are cards that the senators get, and this is done with the coordination of the leadership on the Republican side and the Democratic side. And there you see them. The senators write their question down on that card, and then the question is read aloud by the presiding officer, which in this case is Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And in those questions, they say who they'd like to answer the question, either the president's counsel or the impeachment managers, or both sometimes. And then those lawyers will get up and answer the question, and you will rotate back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the goal is to allow a bunch of different senators to ask questions. Sometimes senators will actually get together and ask the question together. So in the last impeachment trial, a little over a year ago, you could have a question that was asked by 5 different senators. And what'll be interesting to see is whether Democrats direct their questioning, for example, to the House impeachment managers, or do they direct pointed questions to the defense counsel and vice versa. They only have 4 hours total, so each side gets about 2 hours to ask their questions. And then we move to a phase that's kind of up in the air right now, Nora, and that is the question of witnesses and whether there should be any witnesses in this trial. The House impeachment team was asked 3 times on a background briefing this morning whether they were going to call for witnesses in this trial. And each time they told us, we have no announcements for you. They really haven't said one way or the other. We know from talking to senators that most of them don't seem to believe that witnesses are necessary in this trial. They think it would take up a lot of time. They feel like they know the gist of this storyline at this point. There are some exceptions. Senator Bill Cassidy, for example, of Louisiana, who surprisingly voted with Democrats and decided that this is a constitutional proceeding. He wants to know a little bit more about the president's call with his colleague Tommy Tuberville. senator from Alabama, when the president was pushing Tuberville to delay the election counting process, even after Tuberville told him that the vice president had been rushed out of the room for his own safety, and then the president tweeted negative comments about the vice president 10 minutes after that. Cassidy has said he wants to hear more about that. That could be an interesting witness. But at this point, we simply don't know whether either side is going to call for witnesses, because that's something that could delay this trial for quite a while if it happens. They have to decide, you know, who's going to testify, when, do they testify in person, do they do it in some kind of deposition setting and then play it for the jurors? You'd have to give that person time to prepare. So that could drag this trial out potentially for a couple of weeks, and that's something that neither side is all that jazzed about right now.
And some new reporting, we are learning that the Trump team was given all the video and audio used by impeachment managers before the trial. So that may
drives a stake in that one.
Call into question some. Yeah, drive a stake, call into question some of the charges that there was unfair due process involved in that. And Major, we've now seen Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, no surprise. He's saying that the Trump lawyers blew the House manager's case out of the water.
Right.
He's a stalwart Trump supporter. The question is whether some of those that are on the fence have been persuaded.
That is the question, and I think Nancy and Ed and I, the consensus we have is here, maybe 3 or 4 Republicans might vote who haven't already voted, bringing the total up to 60, maybe 10 Republicans. But I'm even doubtful about that. But I think 3 or 4 is the absolute maximum of potential persuadable Republicans. And because it was forceful, because there was so much aggressive language, a lot of Republicans will say, well, yeah, that's a fight. I sort of see this in a slightly different perspective. But 2 quick observations about this due process argument. First of all, the Trump lawyers have said this is a terrible affront to basic fairness. You would never see this in a courtroom. You know what you would also not see? The defense counsel huddling with a jury. How about that? So if you're going to talk about what's blatantly unfair and how process is being violated, it's permissible to do that, as it's permissible, as Jeffrey Rosen pointed out, to not have an aggressive due process. Oh, by the way, the Trump defense team also said, basically, you don't need due process in this case because any plain reading of the president's statement on January 6th proves he didn't incite this. They're basically saying you don't need any further investigation. Just read the speech as it is. You could by no means declare that incitement to violence. So by their own words, they're essentially devaluing this due process argument because they're saying you don't need it. Just read the speech. There's nothing incitement. There's nothing inciting about that. So you dig deeply into the defense argument. A lot of it is show, not much of it is substance, but it will have the desired effect, acquittal.
Right.
And Nora, what we heard from Republican senators as they came out of yesterday's arguments was an indication that their eventual likely votes to acquit are they're going to defend them in one of 2 ways. A number of them are going to say that they still don't believe that this process is constitutional in the first place, that he's a former president and that he shouldn't be subject to impeachment. And then they're also going to say they don't feel that he ever explicitly called for violence and therefore shouldn't be convicted.
Rewriting the narrative is part of their defense. Let's listen in now as they have returned after almost 40 minutes from a break that was supposed to be 15 minutes long.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, good afternoon. It has been my great privilege over the past couple of weeks to lead this outstanding team of lawyers and dedicated professionals in the defense of the 45th President of the United States. One of the most difficult things in leading such a talented group is deciding who's responsible for what and the strategy and the order in which we will present our evidence. And you have heard from Mr. Van der Veen and Mr. Schoen on the importance of the First Amendment and the importance of due process of law. And because I had the opportunity to set out the schedule, I decided that I would take the last substantive part of the case for myself. You can take that two ways. The first, perhaps, is the best, and that would be that it's almost over. The second is that perhaps you have to wait another hour for it to be over. The reason why I chose this section, and believe me, it was a very difficult decision to make because I thought that the other arguments presented by Mr. Schoen and Mr. Van der Veen were outstandingly researched, thoroughly vetted, and wonderfully and articulately presented by them. But the critical issue in this case is the very narrow issue that is charged against the 45th president. And that issue is, did the 45th president engage in incitement of, they continue to say, insurrection? Clearly, there was no insurrection. Insurrection is a term of art defined in the law. It involves taking over a country, a shadow government, taking the TV stations over, and having some plan on what you're going to do when you finally take power. Clearly, this is not that. What our colleagues here across the aisle meant is incitement to violence, to riot. So the word incitement is the critical case and the critical issue in the case. Now, the first time that you heard from us, I told you that you would never hear from our side that what happened on January 6th was anything other than horrific, and that the 45th President of the United States and his lawyers and his entire team adamantly denounce that violence by those criminals that occurred in this very chamber, this very building. There was a reason why we started our presentation back on Tuesday in that way. Because I did not want the senators to consider that there was any challenge to that particular fact. And yet, the House managers, knowing it was not contested at all, chose to spend 14+ hours showing you pictures of how horrific the attack on the United States Capitol was. They spent no time at all in connecting legally the attack on the Capitol to the 45th President of the United States, which is the only question that needs to be answered, is, was Donald Trump responsible for inciting the violence that came to this building on January 6th? Now, by any measure, President Trump is the most pro-police, anti-mob rule president this country has ever seen. His real supporters know this. He made it clear throughout his presidency. He made it clear during the violence this past summer. He made it clear on January 6th. But politics changes things. Politics has created and interposed an element that should not be here. It has interposed the element of hatred. And the political world changes when hatred becomes part of the dynamic. As we wrote in our answer to the original charging document, and I hope that this is a phrase that lives on long after we are all departed, and that I hope someday this becomes the mantra by which all of us operate who work for the benefit of the public. That political hatred has no place in the American justice system, and most certainly no place in the Congress of the United States. To illustrate the contrast that I am speaking of, we have a video.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
The vast majority of the protests have been peaceful.
Republicans stand for law and order, and we stand for justice.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
My administration will always stand against violence, mayhem, and disorder.
There needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
I stand with the heroes of law enforcement.
And you push back on them, and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
We will never defund our police. Together, we will ensure that America is a nation of law and order.
We were in high school, I'd take you behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
But I think you need to go back and punch him in the face. Feel like punching him.
We just want law and order. Everybody wants that. I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. We want law and order. We have to have law and order.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
We believe in safe streets, secure communities, and we believe in law and order.
Is there truly anyone in this chamber who disagrees with the words as spoken by President Trump on that video? Surely not. Surely not. This contrast, and in this context, I ask you to keep that in mind. My colleagues here, actually my colleague here, Mr. Raskin, hopes that you don't. They have used selective editing and manipulated visuals to paint a picture far different from this truth. Make no mistake, and I will repeat it now and anytime I'm ever asked, January 6th was a terrible day for our country. The attack on this building shocked us all. President Trump did not incite or cause the horrific violence that occurred on January 6th, 2021. They know that. We know the president did not incite the riot because of his plain words that day, as Mr. Van der Veen elucidated on a few moments ago. We know the president could not have incited the riots because of the timeline of the events of that day. We heard a great deal from the House manager about their prosecutorial bona fides and their ability to analyze evidence, apply it to statutes, use timelines, and figure out what happened based on circumstantial evidence and direct evidence and testimony and forensic analysis. I can't recall any of the House managers who got up that didn't make some reference to prosecutorial bona fides. Well, I spent more than 3 decades locking up killers, and I do know a little bit about applying the facts to the law. We know that the president would never have wanted such a riot to occur because his long-standing hatred for violent protesters and his love for law and order is on display, worn on his sleeve, every single day that he served in the White House. But if we're going to apply the facts to the statute, it has to be done systematically. It has to be done with precision, the way a court would expect us to do that. Let's look at the letter of the law. Again, Mr. Van der Veen gave you an overview of the Brandenburg case and some of the related cases. You notice that when Mr. Van der Veen listed the elements that he
took verbatim or close to verbatim right out of Brandenburg. They bore no reference whatsoever to the elements that were flashed up by the Democrat managers the other day repeatedly. He actually used the Supreme Court's case. He didn't make it up. Let's look at the letter of the law. The Supreme Court of the United States, over 50 years ago, laid out a clear test to determine whether speech is incitement. Under that test, the Brandenburg versus Ohio test, there are 3 elements that must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt by a preponderance of the evidence, whatever the Senate considers, I suggest, beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the speech in question must explicitly or implicitly encourage the use of violence or lawless action. But here, the president's speech called for peaceful protest. Second, the speaker must intend that his speech will result in the use of violence or lawless action. And again, as Mr. Van der Veen pointed out, the president clearly deplores rioters and political violence and did so throughout his term as president and never hesitated to express his admiration for the men and women that protect this country. Finally, the third element under the Brandenburg test is the imminent use of violence. Imminent use of violence. In other words, right then, the imminent use of violence or lawless action must be the likely result of the speech. The likely result of the speech. Well, that argument is completely eviscerated by the fact that the violence was pre-planned, as confirmed by the FBI, Department of Justice, and even the House managers, not the result of the speech at all. Several of my colleagues at the House managers got up and spoke about the proceeding in the House being like a grand jury proceeding. Well, I've been in grand jury proceedings. I have run grand juries. In grand jury proceedings, you call witnesses. You hear evidence. You make transcripts. You take affidavits. You develop physical evidence. You hear reports from police officers. You hear forensic analysis from scientists. In fact, you invite the target of the grand jury to come in and testify if he or she pleases to be heard by the grand jury. Which one of those things happened in the House prior to the impeachment article? I don't believe any of them happened. So the suggestion that what happened in the House was anything at all like a grand jury investigating a case and preferring it for prosecution is complete nonsense. And if the House managers are trying to fool you about that, you must ask yourself, what else are they trying to fool you about? Let's look more closely at the president's speech. We have mentioned this line before, but it is so critical we need to talk about it again. The president asked that the attendees at his rally peacefully make their voices heard.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
The managers would have you believe that the president's supporters usually follow his every word, but in this case, imputed some imaginary meaning to them while ignoring his most clear instructions. President Trump said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, and the House managers took from that, go down to the Capitol and riot. So you are supposed to put yourselves in the heads of the people who hear peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard and conclude that those words do not mean what the president said. More than that, the president criticized the destruction wrought by left-wing anarchists and rioters. He told his supporters that they build, they don't destroy.
If this happened to the Democrats, there'd be hell all over the country going on. There'd be hell all over the country. But just remember this, you're stronger, you're smarter, you've got more going than anybody, and they try and demean everybody having to do with us. And you're the real people. You're the people that built this nation. You're not the people that tore down our nation.
Is it possible, listening to those words in the proper cadence without them being edited or the sound changed so that they're indistinguishable or sounds as though the crowd is right there, but listening to it as you have here, unedited by us, is it possible that President Trump's disdain for political violence could be any clearer to the persons listening as he was speaking? Is it possible that his words could have been misunderstood? I suggest to you that is impossible. Now, the House manager said the president told the crowd, quote, "You have to get out your people to fight." The House manager's claim is that the President of the United States was telling the audience to get each other to physically fight. But that is not what the President said. The people who should fight, he said, were members of Congress. If they don't fight, what the President said is, what should the rally attendees do? If members of Congress wouldn't fight for the principles they held dear, what was it that the President specifically told his supporters at that rally he wanted them to do? He wanted them to support primary challenges. Now, nobody in this chamber is anxious to have a primary challenge. That is one truism I think I can say with some certainty. But that's the way we operate in this country. When the people of a state want to change their representatives and their senators, they use the electoral process. President Trump told his listeners that if their members of Congress won't fight for their views, then go back home and find others that will. That's what President Trump said. The people who should fight were the members of Congress.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them.
You have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them. We're gonna let you know who they are. I could already tell you, frankly.
It is pretty stark contrast when you watch that video, isn't it? When you see the House manager tell you, and I don't know if we're under oath here, but when I walked into this room, I sure as heck felt I was under oath, and that I was speaking not only to senators of the United States, but before the entire world and with God watching. And a House manager got up here and told you that the President of the United States on January the 6th, 2021, told the crowd that they had to go and fight. And the implication that they wanted you to draw was that he was sending them down to Capitol Hill to go and breach the building and trash the very sacred halls of Congress. But we now know that is not at all anything near what the President said. What the President said was, if you can't get your members of Congress to do as you would like them to do, you primary them. That's the American way. The first way that the House managers presented and wanted you to conclude that's the criminal way. But what the president said was the American way. Again, House managers manipulated President Trump's words. I can't stand here and pretend to tell you that I know every time from all those videos that the House managers manipulated what the president said, put up evidence that was not with the foundation of correctness and admissibility we expect. I can't tell you that I picked up every one. I don't think Mr. Van der Veen or Mr. Schoen or any of the others that worked with us can tell you that. But what I can tell you is that there were an awful lot of times, and I know at least some of you were judges in previous lives, and if one of the lawyers was able to create the impression that one side intentionally presented false or misleading evidence, that judge would give an instruction called falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one thing, false in everything. In other words, if they're trying to fool you about one thing, not only might they be trying to fool you in something else, but under that maxim of the law, you may conclude they're trying to fool you in everything else. President Trump was immediate in his calls for calm and respect for law enforcement. The House managers emphasized President Trump's tweet in the 6 p.m. hour where he told crowds to, quote, go home in love and peace and remember this day. What is it that they left out? Well, the House starts their recitation of what President Trump said as far as the aftermath of when the Capitol was breached at roughly 6 p.m. What they don't tell you and didn't tell you, and which you probably don't know because I think I'm the first one to say it in this forum, is at 2:38, President Trump urged protesters at the U.S. Capitol to, quote, stay peaceful, please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful. And before we run the graphic, I just want to point out to you, President Trump's speech ended at 1:11 p.m. So at 2:38 p.m., by the time word reaches the president that there's a problem down here, he's out urging people to support the police, stay peaceful, support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are on the side of the country. Stay peaceful. At 3:13 p.m., President Trump urged protesters at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. 3:13 p.m. President Trump's words couldn't have incited the riot at the Capitol. The day's events make this clear. Let's walk through the actual timeline. At 11:15 a.m., police security camera videos show crowds forming at First Street near the Capitol reflecting pool. This is a full 45 minutes before President Trump even took the stage on January 6th. Let me repeat that. Violent criminals were assembling at the Capitol over a mile away almost an hour before the president uttered a single word on the ellipse. You did not hear that fact during the hours and hours of the House manager's presentation, did you? When the president spoke, what did he call for? He called for rally attendees to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard. for them to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to cheer on members of Congress. President Trump went on for more than an hour, ending at 1:11. Now, why is this important? Because of all of the events that I am about to describe, they all occurred before President Trump's remarks concluded. At 12:49 p.m., the first barriers at the U.S. Capitol grounds were pushed over and the crowd entered the restricted area. At 11:05 p.m., Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller received open source reports of demonstrator movements to the U.S. Capitol. At 1:09 p.m., U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund called the House and Senate sergeants at arms, telling them he wanted an emergency declared and he wanted the National Guard called. The point? Given the timeline of events, the criminals at the Capitol weren't there at the ellipse to even hear the president's words. They were more than a mile away, engaged in their pre-planned assault on this very building. This was a pre-planned assault, make no mistake, and that is a critical fact. Watch this.
Does anyone in this chamber honestly believe that but for the conduct of President Trump, that a charge in the article of impeachment, that attack at the Capitol would have occurred? Does anybody believe that?
It was not some sort of spontaneous decision by a bunch of, quote, protesters to go up to Capitol Hill and storm Capitol Hill. This was all planned out.
How much of it was planned? How much of this was strategized ahead of time?
They are getting indications, some evidence that they've seen that indicates that there was some level of planning.
There appears to be premeditation.
FBI internal report the day before the siege, warning of a violent war at the Capitol.
The FBI issued a warning of a, quote, war at the Capitol.
The FBI warned law enforcement agencies about this specific attack.
Be ready to fight. Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in.
We developed some intelligence that a number of individuals were planning to travel to the D.C. area with intentions to cause violence. We immediately shared that information.
And they pushed out that information through this JTTF structure.
It was immediately disseminated through a written product and briefed through our command post operations to all levels of law enforcement.
The FBI says 2 pipe bombs discovered near the Capitol on January 6th were placed there the night before.
New video appears to show a person suspected of planting pipe bombs near the U.S. Capitol the night before.
The FBI now says the bombs were planted the night before the Capitol siege between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m.
They were planted the day before.
All goes to the idea of premeditation and coordination among individuals.
This was a planned assault as if going after a castle.
So to answer the question of the House manager, does anybody believe that this would have occurred but for the speech from Donald Trump? I do. All of these facts make clear the January 6th speech did not cause the riots. The president did not cause the riots. He neither explicitly or implicitly encouraged the use of violence or lawless action, but in fact called for peaceful exercise of every American's First Amendment rights to peacefully assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. In other words, the Brandenburg Standard is not made out. The House managers admitted many facts are unknown. Even Speaker Pelosi admitted not knowing the real cause of the violence when she called for a 9/11-style commission to examine the facts and causes that led to the violence. On the screen is Speaker Pelosi's call for the 9/11 Commission. Let's touch now on the second absurd and conflated allegation in the House manager's single article. President Trump's phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Ben Roethlisberger surreptitiously recorded, by the way, included multiple attorneys and others on the call. Let me point out the very obvious fact that the House managers ignored. The private call that was made public by others cannot really be the basis to claim that the president intended to incite a riot, because he did not publicly disclose the contents of the call. How could he have hoped to use this call to invite his followers if he had no intent to make the conversation public and indeed had nothing to do with it being secretly recorded? The House managers told you that the president demanded that the Georgia Secretary of State, quote, find just over 11,000 votes. The word find, like so many others the House managers highlighted, is taken completely out of context. And the word find did not come out of thin air. Based on an analysis of publicly available voter data that the ballot rejection rate in Georgia in 2016 was approximately 6.42%. And even though a tremendous amount of new first-time mail-in ballots were included in the 2020 count, the Georgia rejection rate in 2020 was a mere 0.4%, a drop-off from 6.42% to 0.4%. President Trump wanted the signature verification to be done in public. How can a request for signature verifications to be done in public be a basis for a charge for inciting a riot? With that background, it is clear that President Trump's comments and the use of the word find were solely related to his concerns with the inexplicable dramatic drop in Georgia's ballot rejection rates. Let's examine how the word find was used throughout that conversation. Mr. Trump's first use of the word find was as follows, quote, we think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple 100,000 of forged signatures of people who have been forged. And we are quite sure that's going to happen. President Trump also used find as follows, quote, now why aren't we doing signature and why can't it be open to the public? And why can't we have professionals do it instead of rank amateurs who will never find anything and don't want to find anything? They don't want to find, you know, they don't want to find anything. Someday you'll tell me the reason why, because I don't understand your reasoning. But someday you'll tell me the reason why. But why don't you want to find? President Trump echoed his previous sentiments, again in the context of pursuing a legitimate and robust investigation into the lack of signature verification for mail-in and absentee ballots. Quote, and why can't we have professionals do it instead of rank amateurs who will never find anything and don't want to find anything? They don't want to find anything, you know, they don't want to find anything. They don't want to find, you know, they don't want to find anything. Someday you'll tell me why, because I don't understand your reasoning, but someday you'll tell me why. But why don't you want to find? We can go through signature verification and we'll find hundreds of thousands of signatures, and you can let us do it. And the only way you can do it, as you know, is to go to the past. But you didn't do that in Cobb County. You just looked at one page compared to another. The only way you could do a signature verification is to go from one that signed it on November whatever, recently, and compare it to 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, you know, or even one. And you'll find that you have many different signatures. But in Fulton, where they dumped ballots, you will find that you have many that aren't even signed and that you have many forgeries, end quote. Mr. Trump continued to use the word fine throughout the conversation. Each and every other time in the context of his request that Mr. Raffensperger undertake a review of signature verifications, and his concerns generally with ballot integrity and his reported electoral deficit, here are a few examples. Quote, "But why wouldn't you want to find the right answer, Brad? Instead of keep saying that the numbers are right, because those numbers are so wrong." Another example, quote, "We think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures, going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple 100,000 of forged signatures of people who have been forged, and we are quite sure that's going to happen," end quote. Moreover, there was nothing untoward with President Trump, or any other candidate for that matter, speaking with the lead elections officer of a state. That's why the Georgia Secretary of State took a call along with members of his team, one of whom decided to record it and release it to the press. The only reason this conversation is being discussed in this chamber is because, once again, the media and their Democratic allies distorted the true conversation to mislead you and the American public. So we have a complete lack of evidence for the article of impeachment presented by the House managers. So why are we here? Politics. Their goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters.
Why bother with a Senate trial of Donald Trump? He's no longer president.
He'll be out of office anyway.
Is it to keep him from ever running again?
Make sure he can never run for office again.
Keep him from running for office again.
Donald Trump would not be able to run for office again.
Barring him from running for office again.
Disqualified from running for office.
Disqualify him from ever running from office again.
Disqualified from running for office again.
It's about focusing that he can never run again.
Remove him from ever running for office again.
Never be able to run for office again.
To ban former President Trump from running again.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
The goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters. Members of the Senate, our country needs to get back to work. I know that you know that. But instead, we are here. The majority party promised to unify and deliver more COVID relief. But instead, they did this. We will not take most of our time today, us of the defense, in the hopes that you will take back these hours and use them to get delivery of COVID relief to the American people. Let us be clear. This trial is about far more than President Trump. It is about silencing and banning the speech the majority does not agree with. It is about canceling 75 million Trump voters and criminalizing political viewpoints. That is what this trial is really about. It's the only existential issue before us. It asks for constitutional cancel culture to take over in the United States Senate. Are we going to allow canceling and banning and silencing to be sanctioned in this body? To the Democrats who view this as a moment of opportunity, I urge you instead to look to the principles of free expression and free speech. I hope truly that the next time you are in the minority, you don't find yourself in this position. To the Republicans in this chamber, I ask, when you are next in the majority, please resist what will be an overwhelming temptation to do this very same thing to the opposing party. Members of the Senate, this concludes the formal defense of the 45th President of the United States to the impeachment article filed by the House of Representatives. I understand that there is a procedure in place for questions, and we await them. Thereafter, we will close on behalf of President Trump. Mr. President, we yield the balance of our time.
And I ask unanimous consent. We take a 15-minute recess.
Without objection, the Senate will stand in recess.
And it appears that the lawyers for former President Trump have used just 2.5 hours of their 16 hours allotted by the rules to defend the former president against a potential conviction by the United States Senate. Let's bring in our panel of Nancy Cordes, Major Garrett, and Ed O'Keefe. And Nancy, there were some claims made that I think we're going to have to fact check that were just made by the president's defense attorney.
Sure. Starting with the fact that he said that the president never encouraged violence, that he never knew that this could possibly happen, when what we've seen laid out by the House impeachment managers is that the president often embraced his supporters who were violent. He retweeted them. He invited them to the Oval Office. He often held meetings with them at the White House, as Major well knows, and often turned a blind eye to that violence, even when supporters of his, for example, concocted a plan to kidnap the governor of Michigan. The fact that this defense was so brief, Nora, was really striking, because they basically ignored enormous swaths of the prosecution's case. They never addressed things like why he so often condoned violent groups, or why he pushed a conspiracy for months that ended up riling up his supporters. Why didn't he condemn the violence right away on the day of the insurrection? Why wasn't he involved in the decision to send in the National Guard? They had plenty of time with which to try to knock down some of the arguments that were made by the House impeachment managers, and they just decided not to do it.
In fact, they said that it wasn't even an insurrection that happened on the Capitol, and right. That the speech that the president gave on January 6th did not cause the riots, in his words. And I think that they just flat out denied even the premise of what he was impeached on.
Right, and they'll have to be at odds with the FBI on that one, because U.S. law enforcement has come out very clearly and stated that this was an armed insurrection, an attempt to interfere with the government of the United States. So this is a situation where the defense attorneys weren't just at odds with the impeachment managers, but they are at odds with the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Nora, we also need to talk about Georgia, because the defense attorneys made some assertions trying to describe the president's call with, let us be clear on this, the Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, not the current Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback Ben Roethlisberger, as Mr. Castor described him at one point, that it was all very benign, that the president was just trying to find something that had yet to be found. Well, let's be clear on what happened in Georgia. There were 3 recounts in Georgia. One of them, statewide, was by hand. There was an absolute, positive, repetitive verification of the ballots legally submitted and legally counted. This has been adjudicated in the courts there. A Trump-appointed judge rejected this particular line of reasoning. And this interpretation that it was just benign, the president was just trying to find something that was findable, is not based on facts in Georgia. And it also leaves out a couple of other component parts of this. The president made a separate phone call to another Georgia official, pressuring that person to find things that were not findable. And the U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Georgia was fired by this president because he wasn't aggressive enough pursuing things. If anyone believes that is the proper conduct of a president, carrying out his constitutional obligation to defend the Constitution and the laws, that's an interesting interpretation of presidential conduct, because it's not just about this one phone call. It's about several other steps the president took in Georgia to suggest something had occurred which hadn't occurred, number one, and that 3 separate recounts were invalid simply because they did not produce the results the president wanted. That is an essential fact check to the verifiable history of what happened in Georgia, and that we need to clarify that.
And that's why I asked that question, because I think there were just so many outright factual inaccuracies made that in case you just dig down, some might just swallow them and believe them to be truth. So on these points, let's bring in CBS News legal expert Jeffrey Rosen, because we heard Mr. Castor start his closing argument and saying, look, we're not trying to, we agree, we denounce the violence, but let's be clear, it wasn't an insurrection, which sort of said, what is he trying to argue there? And just to make clear, we'll get your analysis too, but we just want to show everybody what the dictionary calls an insurrection. We made it into a graphic, just in case you don't believe us. You can see what is in the dictionary. It's an act or an instance of revolting, especially violently, against civil or political authority or against an established government. Jeffrey.
I'm so glad that you showed the dictionary definition, because that's what it is. And viewers can make up their own mind whether, it's a common sense example of revolting against an established government's political or civil authority. There is, of course, a legal definition of insurrection. It's in 18 U.S. Code 2383, and that says whoever incites, sets foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States shall be fined or imprisoned, and so forth. So that code doesn't define the word insurrection, leading us, if we were judges, to go to the dictionary, just as you did, and to post the definition. All this is to say that if President Trump were charged under that section of the U.S. Code for inciting insurrection, Mr. Castor might have a better argument that it doesn't meet the technical legal definition, because there's a case law about it, and we'd have to read that to say what that is. But this is not a criminal trial. We can't say that enough times. This is the Senate of the United States. They're going to use what the common sense definition of insurrection is. And I guess if a senator concluded that that armed mob at the Capitol was not attempting to revolt against the civil and political authority of the United States, then they could conclude it wasn't an insurrection, and others could vote different ways. But it's not a legal question, ultimately. It's a question of common sense, and that's why reading the dictionary is an excellent place to start.
And also, Jeffrey, because it was brought up, it's a case that we've talked about previously as we've covered this impeachment trial, the case of Brandenburg v. Ohio, about political speech that is protected unless it incites violence. Explain that case and, of course, what we saw in terms of both sides trying to pick apart that precedent by the Supreme Court.
Yes, it's important. Every day we should remind ourselves of that case, because that's the core of President Trump's legal defense. And that case from 1969 said that even advocacy of violence is protected by the First Amendment. It's a very strong statement. Advocacy of violence is protected unless that advocacy is directed to and likely to produce imminent violence or lawless action. So that's a high standard to meet. The speech has to be directed to cause the violence, and that's why we're talking so much about President Trump's intention. It has to be likely to cause the violence, and we know violence did result, but the question is, would an ordinary or objective observer respond with violence? And then it also has to be foreseeable and predictable.
Imminent.
Now, imminent, absolutely. Right, imminent. So it's not just, go march in 2 weeks, which is the case in Brandenburg, which is why the speech was protected. It's go march now. But despite, and so that's the core of the defense. You asked me during the last break, what's President Trump's strongest defense? It's that this speech would not meet the Brandenburg standard. And if this were in a criminal trial, you'd have good arguments on both sides. It's an extraordinarily high standard to meet. There are good arguments on both sides, but this is not a criminal trial. So that's why the president's lawyers yesterday said it's a constitutional standard. Did he try to subvert the laws? We don't have to meet the Brandenburg standard in order to find him guilty.
Right. And I'm glad you broke that down so clearly as only you can do, that is so digestible and understandable for everybody, because that's why then the Trump defense was the January 6th speech did not cause the riots, just as law enforcement has said these were pre-planned, these riots. So it did not produce, the president's speech did not produce imminent violence because it had been pre-planned well in advance. Was that an effective argument by the Trump defense?
Yes, I think it's the most effective argument, that speech itself was not the match that lit the fire or the conflagration, as the defense lawyer said, but that the speech had been planned over a period of time. Now, the managers say the pattern of months of inciting speech is why the Brandenburg standard is so clearly met. You don't have to have just one speech that caused the imminent violence. The fact that it was being planned over time, they say the president should have known and in fact intended for the violence to result because he saw that it was being planned over a period of time. So for the managers, they're saying, look at the context, start back in July, see in October, this was part of a building conspiracy. And again, if this were a criminal trial, they'd have a decent case that we should look at the speech in context, going back several months, not just one single speech. But this is the nub of the disagreement, and that's why it's well worth debating and focusing on.
Yes, and I'm so glad, and that's why Manager Raskin said that, in fact, the violence on January 6th was the culmination of acts by the president, not an aberration, and why we saw them use almost their full 16 hours to carefully lay out their case, including going all the way back to April and the attacks at the Michigan Capitol to say that was a dress rehearsal, in the words of Democrats, for what then happened at the U.S. Capitol. Jeffrey Rosen, thank you. Let's bring back in our panel of Major Garrett, Nancy Cordes, and Ed O'Keefe. And that is, that's, I think, I wanted to lay that out. The nub of that is, as Jeffrey said it, because that, I think, is ultimately going to be, for the Republican senators that vote to acquit the former president, they will use that at the crux of their, in their press statements and arguments to say that's why we should not move to convict former President Trump.
If I may, just real quick, Nora, you guys laid out the legal arguments there about failed insurrection quite well. I'll be very curious now. We don't know, for example, how Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is going to vote ultimately, but I've been reminded that it was he who called it a failed insurrection that night on the floor of the Senate chamber. So one wonders if this wasn't a tactical mistake potentially by the former president's lawyers, because the Senate leader could now turn around and say, no, I actually do think it was a failed insurrection, whether you believe it or not. He said this failed attempt to obstruct the Congress, this failed insurrection, only underscores how crucial the task before us is for our republic, he said, as they were reconvening to count the electoral votes. So by making that argument, they are defending the president, the former president, in their belief, but they could very well be, creating an opening for some of these Republicans who may be wavering.
And in a technical sense, it's not an insurrection because it didn't succeed fully in toppling the government.
Yeah.
But it did succeed in driving the House of Representatives out of its chamber, the Senate out of its chamber, and stopping a constitutionally mandated process. That sounds like insurrectionist to me, in any classical definition, any dictionary or practical, commonsensical definition.
Right.
And House Republicans and Senate Republicans basically agree on that. And to suggest to them, that's not what happened, put something right in front of them that they know did happen, they were eyewitnesses to, traumatized victims of, and have to render a judgment on. And the other thing about this, Nora, is the defense for the president is all of this is frozen in time. Basically, just evaluate life as America was, Eastern time zone, noon to 3 p.m., January 6th. Nothing else. Nothing else. Nothing the president ever said or how he was aware, situationally and otherwise, about what his supporters were saying quite publicly, about their intentions coming to the Capitol, about the things he had suggested about how this election was stolen and that something had to be done about it, and this day was the day to do something about it. And the tweets with the president saying, don't be violent, support the police. I'm quite confident that other Republicans living with the horror of that day were on our air and other television networks long after those tweets saying the president has to do more and has to say more. And in the words of some, only he can stop this. So quite clearly, people within the president's own party in the moment did not find those tweets persuasive, helpful, or relevant at all, even though the defense made some point of saying, well, look what the president was doing, as if it was a fulsome activity. Republicans in the chamber or elsewhere said it wasn't and went on our air to so declare.
And in their extraordinarily brief defense of the president, just about 2.5 hours, did Trump's lawyers ever address that question that's hanging out there? Even by some Republican senators have said they plan to ask. Did they ever address the question about why the president didn't call off the mob earlier? Why he didn't tweet that or do anything to try and stop the violence?
They made a passing reference to his tweets where he said that people should stay peaceful. But even those tweets have come under the microscope from the House impeachment managers who said stay peaceful. Things were already not peaceful at that point. Why didn't you do more? Why didn't you more forcefully or ever denounce the violence itself and say, you've got to go home, you've got to stop what you're doing, this is wrong? Why didn't the president ever do that? Why wasn't he involved in the decision to send the National Guard? Why was he still attacking his own vice president on Twitter even after the insurrection began? So no, that was not something that they addressed at all. They chose to highlight the one or two tweets where he said, had sort of this milquetoast kind of comment that people should stay peaceful, and they also highlighted his line in his speech earlier that day where he said that people should peacefully and patriotically march to the Capitol. But Major is absolutely right. They did nothing to address all of his speech in the months leading up to Insurrection Day.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring in Nicole Killian. She's covering the trial from Capitol Hill. And Nicole, walk us through the next steps now that the defense has rested.
Well, the next phase of this trial will move into question and answers. And so we expect that will take about 4 hours. Senators will have up to 4 hours to ask questions of both the former president's legal team as well as the House impeachment managers, and they will do this in a different format. They're not going to necessarily raise their hands and ask those questions out loud. Instead, they will be filling out these cards, and I want to show you what it looks like. So you see here there is a line for the senator to write his or her name. Then they can say whether they are asking a question of the president's counsel or House impeachment managers, and then they can list their question here. Also, multiple senators can ask a question together in addition to senators submitting individual questions. So then these cards will get handed off to the presiding officer, Senator Patrick Leahy, who will then read these cards aloud, and then, of course, the respective teams will get a chance to respond at the podium. And you guys talked about some of the questions that some of these senators have, in terms of why the former president did not necessarily call off this response. But, there are other questions, too, that many lawmakers want to know. For instance, Chris Coons told reporters that, one question he has in light of all of these videos that were shown of Democrats, using inflammatory language in the view of the defense team, when in those instances has it led to this kind of level of violence that was witnessed here at the Capitol? So that is something that Chris Coons wants to know. You also have senators like Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, who does want more clarity on the timeline and also wants to know from the defense team, how they defend the former president's election claims and claims of election fraud. So that gives you a little bit of insight into what some of these senators want to know. But again, they'll have about 4 hours to have this exchange with both the former president's team and the House impeachment managers.
Nicole Killian, thank you so much, and also bringing some props from inside so we can see, so the American people can see exactly those cards that senators can fill out and ask questions. And as Nicole so brilliantly laid out the next phase of this, in some ways it could be very interesting because this is not the prepared remarks. This is not, you know, what they have meticulously worked on in terms of reading from their briefs. It's a bit more extemporaneous as they have to answer questions from these senators that go to the very heart of the matter. Let's bring back in our panel. And we've already heard from a number of senators about some of the questions that they have. Correct, Nancy?
That's right. And I think you're going to see Democrats in particular with a lot of questions for the president's counsel about some of these issues that they left out of their arguments. Very pointed questions. Is the reason that you didn't address this because you don't feel that there is any defense of the president's behavior when he did A, B, and C? Why, why was he attacking his own vice president? Why did he embrace a conspiracy theory when there was no proof for it? Uncomfortable questions like that that they may not want to answer. But Nora, I have to tell you that what we're hearing more and more from Senate Republicans as they come out of these arguments is that they still don't feel that this is appropriate, that they don't feel that this is a constitutional process. And what I've heard now from more than one Senate Republican is that they're worried about the precedents that convicting a former president rather than a sitting president will set, that it will encourage future Senates to go after former presidents of an opposing party, and that is a precedent they don't want to set. They haven't said much about the precedent that you set. If you don't punish a former president who encourages an uprising against the Congress of the United States, that would be a dangerous precedent to set as well. But you're starting to hear the outlines of an argument that I think a lot of Senate Republicans are going to use if they do ultimately vote to acquit.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. I want to bring in Jeffrey Rosen, who's still with us. And Jeffrey, so on that point, didn't the impeachment managers address that very concern in their presentation about setting precedent and convicting someone who is no longer in office?
Well, they certainly did. They said that precedent has already been addressed in that the framers were determined in extreme cases to ensure that presidents who really abuse their power be convicted, that the Senate had decided this before and decided to try former officers, and that it would be reserved for the most grave derelictions of duty. And that's why they said, to pick up on the counter argument, if this isn't impeachable, what is impeachable? Talk about precedent, said the managers. This is the very core of the purpose for which the impeachment clause was added to the Constitution. And if you don't use it in this circumstance, it would completely drain the clause of any meaning. So that's an interesting clash of precedents.
And in fact, to put an exclamation point on what you just said, the impeachment managers said that there is no January exemption. That in fact, that if you can no longer hold presidents accountable once they leave office, then why wouldn't future presidents just go wild in their final month in office in January? If they won't be held accountable, why wouldn't they do a series of things that are egregious behavior because they can't be impeached, so says, or convicted because of the precedent that it sets? That was part of their argument too.
Very well put. And that's why, the Senate is like a Supreme Court in this case. It's evaluating its own past precedents. And that's why it's relevant, as the House managers did, to cite all of those precedents where the Senate decided in the past that you can't allow someone to resign at the last minute because that would make them unaccountable. And that's why they said creating this new January exception precedent would be so dangerous. That's why they cited John Quincy Adams, who stood up before the House and said, I am amenable to this House for my conduct regardless of how long I'm here, even after I'm out of office, because that accountability is so crucial. So precedents can cut both ways, and it's important for the defense, at least, to address the consequences of creating this January exception.
Jeffrey, are you still teaching law school?
I'm on leave from George Washington Law School, but I'm running the National Constitution Center, which teaches live classes on the Constitution free for middle and high school kids 3 times a week. So I hope everyone who's watching will be excited enough to learn about the Constitution and tune on to the National Constitution Center's free constitutional classes at constitutioncenter.org.
Those courses? Should I audit? Can I jump in?
There's nothing.
Should I audit those?
Yeah, can I just, I know, I'll let you jump in too, but I mean, I'm thinking I'm going to go back to law school. I just love listening to Jeffrey on all of these cases. Yeah, so instead, in the meantime, I can just log on.
If there's anything good that can come out of this process, this is a constitutional education for the whole nation. That's really meaningful for all of us to be having these conversations and deciding for ourselves what we think the Constitution should mean.
Nora, if I could, and I'd like Jeffrey to stay with us if possible, let's just go through a thought experiment for a second here, because we're talking about this idea of precedent and what Republicans are fearful of setting in motion. Let's just do a brief thought experiment that goes like this. It's the waning days of the Obama presidency. Donald Trump has won the election, and President Obama says, you know what, I think that the Republicans under Donald Trump are going to do a lot of things in my administration. So I'd like people to come to the steps of the Capitol and stage a sit-in. And they do. And because it's the Obama coalition, it's a diverse coalition of Americans. And they camp out for a day or two. And then some of them, listening to the president's exhortations, get larger in number. And then it becomes larger. And then they begin to trample on the Congress, stop congressional proceedings in protest of things they think might happen. As a thought experiment, considering this idea that Republicans have about setting a dangerous precedent, is there anyone who believes, under those circumstances, Republicans would not endorse an impeachment proceeding against a sitting president named Barack Obama? I ask you.
Jeffrey.
They would. They would. They would. You know they would. They would say this is not consistent with the obligations of the president. They would say that he is asking people to come to Congress to first sit, but then interfere, and that interference is trying to stop something that is political and legislative in our country. And if those were the circumstances, they would be impeaching, whether he was in office or not, President Obama. Does anyone disagree with me?
It's the party of law and order.
Right?
It's the party of supporting the police.
And I don't think that's an outlandish thought experiment to say we have a different situation here, something we've never seen before. So what is the more dangerous precedent? That which happened, or that which you fear might happen in the future?
Right.
You know what?
Well, it's an interesting thought exercise. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
It's so important that senators try to separate their political from their constitutional views. That's what judges are supposed to do, and it's a very difficult thing to do. But what we saw Mitt Romney do in the first impeachment, and when you see and what we saw the Republicans in the Clinton impeachment do, when a senator votes against his or her political interest because he or she thinks the Constitution compels a result, that's when they're doing their job. It's a very difficult thing to do, but it's the definition of principle, and that's why your thought experiment is so important. We should always say, imagine that the shoe is on the other foot, that our party is on the hook. How would we think the Constitution compels? And I hope that at least some senators will engage in precisely that thought experiment during this trial.
I want to also zero in on one other point, because as has been pointed out by some national newspapers, the Capitol assault that happened on January 6th is one of the worst days of injuries for law enforcement since 9/11. The number of Capitol police officers that were injured, the number of D.C. Metro Police that were injured is in the hundreds cumulatively. And that became part of the argument first made by one of the impeachment managers, and where he said, so much for backing the blue, meaning the cops, of course. And that they did address that today. The president's team did address that. Right, Nancy?
You know, yes, they talked about the fact that he has made speeches in the past where he says that he's all for law and order and that he backs the police. And so therefore, he never could have endorsed violence like this because he's on record of being supportive of people playing by the rules and police enforcing those rules. But, you know, if you look at his Twitter feed, it tells a different story. And the House impeachment managers played a number of these Trump supporters who, you know, for example, surrounded a bus full of Biden staffers and almost ran them off the road. And then the president retweeted that and said, "I love Texas." Or another supporter who said, the best Democrat is a dead Democrat. And the president invited him to the Oval Office and tweeted pictures with him as well. And so, you know, there are two sides to that coin. And I think it was another one of the House impeachment managers who made the argument, Nora, that she was there on 9/11, a day when 44 Americans gave up their lives to bring down one of the plane that was headed towards the Capitol. They knew that that would mean certain death for them, but they wanted to protect the people who were in the Capitol because they knew that the plane was likely headed to Washington. And she said the fact that those people, innocent people, gave up their lives only 20 years later to see police officers fending off Trump supporters of a president of the United States because they felt that they had been instructed to attack the Capitol was really chilling. And what we didn't hear, now that I think about it, from these lawyers at all today was any sense that the president regretted anything about his speech or, you know, he didn't mean for this to happen, but, you know, he now wishes he had toned the temperature down in some way. In fact, President Trump himself was kind of an abstract notion in the address today. They didn't, and these lawyers have not met him in person. Right. Some or all of them have not met with President Trump in person in preparation for this trial. So we really didn't get any sense. Maybe this will come up in the question and answer phase that's about to begin. We didn't get any sense about how he feels about his speech now.
If a senator is looking for a question to ask, that would certainly be one worth asking his attorneys. Does the president regret what happened that day, or have any remorse or concern for the law enforcement and for others who were injured or still affected by it all? That would be a perfectly reasonable line of questioning if they want to bring it up.
But as the House managers showed, when asked that very question, the president said, "My remarks were totally appropriate."
Right.
So he's more or less answered that question in the sense that I didn't do anything wrong, and you can't look at my remarks as anything other than just a speech about what I think is important in America. And he's incidental to all this. And I go back again to this thought experiment. Would Republicans say that about President Obama? That he would be incidental to a similar kind of situation in the Capitol? That any president would be incidental to something like that?
Right. And I think you're right.
And they wouldn't.
I think you're right that, you know, are Republicans truly, at the end of the day, worried about this precedent that would be set where you can impeach a former president? Or are they looking for a convenient excuse to vote against something that they know would be incredibly unpopular with their base? I think it's most likely the latter.
Yeah. And it's, you know, Jeffrey.
So coming up, we are now.
Go ahead, Nora.
Sure. I was just going to say, I just wanted to set the stage again for everyone watching. We are what is supposed to be a 15-minute break, but with senators, 15-minute breaks can stretch to an hour.
It's a Senate
That's
15.
the business
Yes.
it's a Senate. Yeah. In fact, that 15 is now a Senate 30 because it's been 30 minutes since that break. But when they return, and why we're still covering this, is going to be the question and answer period that we have talked about. Senators crafting their questions. That may, of course, delay the start of this. And then, of course, Senator Patrick Leahy, who is presiding, will read those questions. And this is somewhat of it's not a cross-examination, but maybe as close as we'll get to where they get to follow up and have follow-up questions, not only for the impeachment managers, but also for the former president's team. You can see there, I think, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa heading back into the Senate chamber. So some are starting to return. What? Did I miss it?
It was
Sorry,
the majority
Chuck
leader.
Schumer, Oh, so that means we probably are closer than I thought, right? Maybe
might very well be.
15
We might very well be.
And you know, Nora, what?
And also, I just let everybody know I need a new pair of glasses. Clearly.
Nora, one of the parlor games during this Q&A that we'll be watching next is to try to read into the questions to get a sense of where senators might come down at the end of the day. Similar to when you're watching a Supreme Court proceeding,
listening to oral arguments,
and
yes.
you know, and you look at the questions that the justices ask to try to get a sense of which way they're leaning. It's very similar. So, you know, everybody will be reading into the questions that are asked, in particular by the Republican senators, to get a sense of who might be leaning towards acquittal and what their questions say about where they stand right now.
And I'll be interested to see if anyone asks some of the things that the defense team alleged about the House managers. You manipulated things, you didn't give us evidence. I'm waiting for someone to ask that question, say, is that exactly what happened? Because that needs to be established one way or the other.
And to get a view of what's happening inside the chamber, let's turn now to one of the jurors in this Senate trial. Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware, joins us now on the phone. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. So first, let me just ask you, are your colleagues paying attention? How intently were they listening there?
Yes, generally, the overwhelming majority of the Senate has paid close attention over the last couple of days. There have been some moments when I've looked around and seen a dozen or more absent. That's disappointing. But, you know, I think today was the Trump team's chance to present his defense, and it was mostly defense by video montage. There were 4 different 7 or 8 minute long videos, which I'm not sure really advanced their case to repeat it.
Mm-hmm. And on those videos, you saw they tried to make the case about political speech, that Democrats engage in the same type of pugilistic speech. They were trying to make the case as Democrats, to fight like hell, to fight for this, to fight for that. In your view as a Democrat, what did they leave out?
Well, what was important for their side was that, yes, they demonstrated that politicians of both parties routinely use the word fight. The context they left out was that the speeches I saw that I was in or colleagues were in, we were talking about fighting for health care or fighting for cleaner air or fighting for better schools, not go fight to stop the counting of the ballots on the one day that we certify an election. The context that I think the House managers laid out really well was that President Trump, for months, had been broadcasting by Twitter his false theory that the election had been stolen from him, that he had changed the time, date, and place for the rally to January 6th at a time where the participants could then go assault the Capitol, and that he had used words like this over and over in his time as a candidate and president. And when his supporters physically assaulted someone at a Trump rally, he would praise them or commend them. All those things in combination give a very different context, give, I think, support for the charge of incitement. And frankly, Nora, for me, the most damning thing was that when President Trump must have known that his own vice president, his incredibly loyal vice president, was at real risk because the Secret Service had whisked him out of the Senate chamber. Hundreds of angry rioters were storming up and down the halls here chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." He did nothing to dispatch relief. He did nothing to check on his safety. And I don't think he's ever expressed regret that in some ways his speech and his actions led to that moment of real danger for Vice President Pence and his family.
And it's our understanding that the former Vice President Mike Pence has not spoken at all with former President Trump since they left office, since the inauguration of President Biden. So there is a rift between the two of them. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, Senator, one of the defense's arguments made today was that it wasn't even an insurrection. How do you respond to that?
Well, an insurrection, in my view, this was an attempt to overthrow, to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, to literally stop the counting of votes in order to allow President Trump to try and remain in power. Technically, whether that does or doesn't qualify as an insurrection under the law, it certainly qualifies as an impeachable offense in that President Trump did not uphold his oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Senator, they've resumed, so I'll let you re-enter the chamber. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senators provide up to 4 hours during which senators may submit questions in writing directed either to the managers on the part of the House of Representatives or counsel for the former president. Majority Leader.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the answers within the 4-hour question period be limited to 5 minutes each. And if the questions are directed to both parties, the times be equally divided. Furthermore, that questions alternate sides for posing questions for as long as both sides have questions.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I have a question at the desk, for the desk.
The senator will submit it. The question from Senator Schumer and Senator Feinstein is directed to the House managers. The clerk will read it.
Isn't it the case that the violent attack and siege on the Capitol on January 6 would not have happened if not for the conduct of President Trump?
Of up to 5 minutes.
To answer your question very directly, Donald Trump summoned the mob. He assembled a mob and he lit the flame. Everything that followed was because of his doing. And although he could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence, he never did. In other words, this violent, bloody insurrection that occurred on January 6th would not have occurred but for President Trump. The evidence we presented at trial makes this absolutely clear. And this attack, as we said, didn't come from one random speech, and it didn't happen by accident, and that mob didn't come out of thin air. Before the election, Donald Trump spread lie after lie about potential fraud. An election, remember, that hadn't even happened yet. Months before the election took place, he was saying it was rigged, that it was going to be stolen, all to make his supporters believe that the only way he was going to lose is if the election was stolen, if the election was rigged. And when he did lose, he spent week after week inciting his supporters to believe that their votes had been stolen and that the election was fraudulent and that it was their patriotic duty to fight like hell to stop the steal and take their country back. And remember, this is in the United States where our vote is our voice. You tell somebody that an election victory is being stolen from them, that's a combustible situation. And he gave them clear direction on how to deal with that. For example, on December 19th, 18 days prior to January 6th, President Trump told them how and where to fight for it. He first issued his call to action for January 6th. This was a save the date sent 18 days before the event on January 6th. And it wasn't just a casual one-off reference or a singular invitation. For the next 18 days, he directed all of the rage he had incited to January 6th. And that was, for him, what he saw as his last chance to stop the transfer of power, to stop from losing the presidency. And he said things like, quote, fight to the death, and January 6th will be a, quote, wild and, quote, historic day. And this was working. They got the message. In the days leading to the attack, report after report, social media post after social media post confirmed that these insurgents were planning armed violence. But they were planning it because he had been priming them, because he had been amping them up. That's why they were planning it. These posts, confirmed by reports from the FBI and Capitol Police, made clear that these insurgents were planning to carry weapons, including guns, to target the Capitol itself. And yet, Donald Trump, from January 5th to the morning of his speech, tweeted 34 times, urging his supporters to get ready to stop the steal. He even, on the eve of the attack, warned us that it was coming. He warned us that thousands were descending into D.C. and would not take it anymore. And when they got here at the Save America March, he told them again in that speech exactly what to do. His lawyer opened with, quote, "Let's have trial by combat." That was Rudy Giuliani. And Donald Trump brought that message home. In fact, he praised Rudy Giuliani as a fighter. And President Trump used the words fight or fighting 20 times in that speech. Remember, you've just told these people, these thousands of people, that somebody has stolen your election, your victory. You're not going to get the president that you love. Senators, that is an incredibly combustible situation when people are armed and they've been saying that they're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. He looked out to a sea of thousands, some wearing body armor, helmets, holding sticks and flagpoles, some of which they would later use to beat Capitol Police, and told them that they could play by different rules. Play by different rules. He even at one point quite literally pointed to the Capitol as he told them to fight like hell. And after the attack, we've shown clearly, that once the attack began, insurgent after insurgent made clear they were following the president's orders. You saw us present that evidence of the insurgents who were there that day, who said, "I came because the president asked me to come. I was here at his invitation." You saw that of the folks that were in the Capitol that day.
The time has expired. Are there further questions?
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina, have a question?
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Submit it.
I send a question to the desk on behalf of myself, Senator Cruz, Marshall, and Kramer to counsel.
Senator Graham for himself, Senator Cruz, Senator Marshall, and Senator Kramer submits a question for the counsel for Donald Trump. Clerk will read it.
Does a politician raising bail for rioters encourage more rioting?
Counsel has 5 minutes.
Yes.
Does counsel yield back the rest of their time? Counsel's time is yielded back. Are there other questions?
Mr. President,
The senator from Georgia.
I have a question for the desk.
Send it to the desk. The senator from Georgia, Senator Warnock, has a question for the House managers. Clerk will read the question.
Is it true or false that in the months leading up to January 6th, dozens of courts, including state and federal courts in Georgia, rejected President Trump's campaign's efforts to overturn his loss to Joe Biden?
House managers recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. President, Senators, that is true. That's true. I want to be clear, though, that we have absolutely no problem with President Trump having pursued his belief that the election was being stolen or that there was fraud or corruption or unconstitutionality. We have no problem at all with him going to court to do it. And he did, and he lost in 61 straight cases in federal court and state court, in the lowest courts in the land, in the U.S. Supreme Court. He lost it. He lost in courts in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, and Wisconsin. All of them said the same thing. They couldn't find any corruption. They couldn't find any fraud, certainly nothing rising to a material level that would alter the outcome of any of the elections, and there was no unconstitutionality. That's the American system. And so, I mean, it's hard to imagine him having gotten more due process than that in pursuing what has come to be known popularly as the big lie, the idea that somehow the election was being stolen from him. And we have no problem with the fact that he went to court to do all those things. But notice, number one, the big lie was refuted, devastated, and demolished in federal and state courts across the land, including by 8 judges appointed by President Donald Trump himself. We quoted earlier in the case what happened in Pennsylvania, where U.S. District Court Judge Matthew Brand said, in the United States, the court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations. In the U.S., this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its 6th most populous state. Our people, laws, and institutions demand more. Then it went up to Judge Stefanos Bibas, who's a Trump appointee, who was a part of the appeals court panel. He said, the campaign's claims have no merit. The number of ballots it specifically challenges is far smaller than the 81,000 vote margin of victory, and it never claims fraud or that any votes were cast by illegal voters. Plus, tossing out millions of mail-in ballots would be drastic and unprecedented, disenfranchising a huge swath of the electorate and upsetting all of the down-ballot races, too, which incidentally weren't being challenged, even though it was the exact same ballot that had been brought. So the problem was when the president went from his judicial combat, which was fine, to intimidating and bullying state election officials and state legislators, and then finally, as Representative Cheney said, summoning a mob, assembling a mob, and then lighting the match for an insurrection against the Union. When he crossed over from nonviolent means, no matter how ridiculous or absurd, that's fine, he's exercising his rights, to inciting violence. That's what this trial is about. And we heard very little of that from the presentation of the president's lawyers. They really didn't address the facts of the case at all. There were a couple propaganda reels about Democratic politicians that would be excluded in any court in the land. They talked about the rules of evidence. All of that was totally irrelevant to the case before us. Whatever you think about it, it's irrelevant. And we'll be happy, of course, to address the First Amendment arguments, too.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.
The question is from Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. It is for the counsel for the former president. Clerk will read.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? What specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Clerk, read that question again. We're getting it back.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? And what specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Mr. Van Veen.
The House managers have given us absolutely no evidence one way or the other onto that question. We're able to piece together a timeline, and it goes all the way back to December 31st, January 2nd. There is a lot of interaction between the authorities and getting folks to have security beforehand. On the day, we have a tweet at 2:38, so it was certainly sometime before then. With the rush to bring this impeachment, there's been absolutely no investigation into that. And that's the problem with this entire proceeding. The House managers did zero investigation, and the American people deserve a lot better than coming in here with no evidence, hearsay on top of hearsay on top of reports that are of hearsay. Due process is required here, and that was denied.
Mr. President.
And the Senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.
The Senator from Nevada, Senator Rosen, submits a question for the House managers. And the clerk will read it.
On January 6th, the anti-Semitic Proud Boys group that President Trump had told to stand by laid siege to the Capitol alongside other rioters, including one wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt. Is there evidence that President Trump knew or should have known that his tolerance of anti-Semitic speech, hate speech, combined with his own rhetoric, could incite the kind of violence we saw on January 6th?
Mr. President, Senators, Donald Trump has a long history of praising and encouraging violence, as you saw. He has espoused hateful rhetoric himself. He has not just tolerated it, but he's encouraged hateful speech by others. He has refused, as you saw in the September debate, that interview, to condemn extremist and white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys. And he has, at every opportunity, encouraged and cultivated actual violence by these groups. Yes, he has encouraged actual violence, not just the word fight. He told groups like the Proud Boys, who had beaten people with baseball bats, to stand by. When his supporters in the 50-car caravan tried to drive a bus of Biden campaign workers off the road, he tweeted a video of that incident with fight music attached to it and wrote, "I love Texas." When his supporters sent death threats to the Republican Secretary of State Raffensperger in Georgia, he responded by calling Mr. Raffensperger an enemy of the state after he knew of those death threats. And in the morning of the 2nd Million MAGA March, when it erupted in violence and burned churches, he began that day with the tweet, "We have just begun to fight." I want to be clear that Donald Trump is not on trial for those prior statements, however that hateful and violent and inappropriate they may be. But his statements, the president's statements, make absolutely clear 3 important points for our case. First, President Trump had a pattern and practice of praising and encouraging violence, never condemning it. It is not a coincidence that those very same people, Proud Boys, organizers of the Trump Caravan, supporters and speakers of the 2nd Million MAGA March, all showed up on January 6th to an event that he had organized with those same individuals who had organized that violent attack. Second, his behavior is different. It's not just that it was a comment by an official to fight for a cause. This is months of cultivating a base of people who were violent, not potentially violent, but were violent. And that prior conduct both helped him cultivate the very group of people that attacked us. It also shows clearly that he had that group assembled, inflamed, and all the public reports ready to attack. He deliberately encouraged them to engage in violence on January 6th. President Trump had spent months calling his supporters to a march on a specific day, at a specific time, for a specific purpose. What else were they going to do to stop the certification of the election on that day but to stop you? But to stop you physically. There was no other way, particularly after his vice president said that he would refuse to do what the president asked. The point is this, that by the time he called the cavalry, not Calvary, but cavalry of his thousands of supporters on January 6th, an event he had invited them to, he had every reason to know that they were armed, violent, and ready to actually fight. He knew who he was calling and the violence they were capable of. And he still gave his marching orders to go to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell to stop the steal. How else was that going to happen? If they had stayed at the ellipse, maybe it would have just been to violently fight in protest with their words. But to come to the Capitol? That is why this is different, and that is why he must be convicted and acquitted. And disqualified.
Mr. President, on behalf of Senator Scott of South Carolina and myself, I'd like to submit a question to the desk.
Senator from Tennessee shall submit it. Thank you. The question is for counsel for the former president from Senators Hagerty and Scott of South Carolina. Clerk will read the question.
Given that more than 200 people have been charged for their conduct at the Capitol on January 6th, that our justice system is working to hold the appropriate persons accountable, and that President Trump is no longer in office, isn't this simply a political show trial that is designed to discredit President Trump and his policies and shame the 74 million Americans who voted for him?
Thank you, Senators, for that question. That's precisely what the 45th President believes this gathering is about. We believe in law and order and trust that the federal authorities that are conducting investigations and prosecutions against the criminals that invaded this building will continue their work and be as aggressive and thorough as we know them to always be, and that they will continue to identify those that entered the inner sanctum of our government and desecrated it. The 45th President no longer holds office. There is no sanction available under the Constitution, in our view, for him to be removed from office that he no longer holds. The only logical conclusion is that the purpose of this gathering is to embarrass the 45th President of the United States and in some way try to create an opportunity for senators to suggest that he should not be permitted to hold office in the future, or at the very least, publicize this throughout the land to try to damage his ability to run for office when and if he is acquitted, and at the same time, tell the 74 million people who voted for them that their choice was the wrong choice. I believe that this is a divisive way of going about handling impeachment, and it denigrates the great solemnity that should attach to such proceedings. I yield the remainder of my time, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I send a question to the House managers to the desk because the President's lawyers did not answer the question when it was posed to them.
The senator will send the question. Debate's not allowed. The question is from Senator Markey with Senator Duckworth to the manager of the part of the House Representatives. The clerk will read the question.
Exactly when did the President learn of the breach at the Capitol, and what steps did he take to address the violence? Please be as detailed as possible.
Just wish to respond.
Mr. President, Senators, this attack was on live TV, on all major networks in real time. The President, as President, has access to intelligence information, including reports from inside the Capitol. He knew the violence that was underway. He knew the severity of the threats. And most importantly, he knew the Capitol Police were overwhelmingly outnumbered and in a fight for their lives against thousands of insurgents with weapons. We know he knew that. We know that he did not send any individuals. We did not hear any tweets. We did not hear him tell those individuals, stop. This is wrong. You must go back. We did not hear that. So what else did the President do? We are unclear. But we believe it was a dereliction of his duty. And that was because he was the one who had caused them to come to the Capitol, and they were doing what he asked them to do. So there was no need for him to stop them from what they were engaged in. But one of the things I would like to ask is we still have not heard and posed to you all the questions that were raised by Mr. Raskin, Manager Raskin, in his closing argument. Why did the President Trump not tell the protesters to stop as soon as he learned about it? Why did President Trump do nothing to stop the attack for 2 hours after the attack began? Why did President Trump do nothing to help protect the Capitol and law enforcement battling the insurgents? You saw the body cam of a Capitol police officer at 4:29, still fighting. 4:29 after, since what time? 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Why did he not condemn the violent insurrection on January 6th? Those are the questions that we have as well. And the reason this question keeps coming up is because the answer is nothing.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Utah.
I send a question to the desk.
The Senator from Utah, Mr. Romney, on behalf of himself and Senator Collins. Submits a question, and the clerk will read it. Oh, and I apologize. The question is for both sides, so the time will be evenly divided.
When President Trump sent the disparaging tweet at 2:24 p.m. regarding Vice President Pence, was he aware that Vice President had been removed from the Senate by the Secret Service for his safety?
The House Manager. And time will be evenly divided between. Of course. Would the clerk read the question again?
When President Trump sent the disparaging tweet at 2:24 p.m. regarding Vice President Pence, was he aware that the Vice President had been removed from the Senate by the Secret Service for his safety?
The House of Representatives managers are recognized 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, let me tell you what he said at 2:24 p.m. He said Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. The USA demands the truth. And you know by now what was all over the media. You couldn't turn on the television, couldn't turn on the radio, couldn't consume any media, or probably take any phone calls or anything else without hearing about this, and also hearing about the Vice President. And here's what Donald Trump had to know at that time, because the whole world knew it. All of us knew it. Live television had, by this point, shown that the insurgents were already inside the building and that they had weapons and that the police were outnumbered. And here are the facts that are not in dispute. Donald Trump had not taken any measures to send help to the overwhelmed Capitol Police. As president, at that point, when you see all this going on and the people around you are imploring you to do something, and your vice president is there, why wouldn't you do it? Donald Trump had not publicly condemned the attack, the attackers, or told them to stand down, despite multiple pleas to do so. And Donald Trump hadn't even acknowledged the attack. And after Wednesday's trial portion concluded, Senator Tuberville spoke to reporters and confirmed the call that he had with the president and did not dispute Manager Cicilline's description in any way that there was a call between he and the president around the time that Mike Pence was being ushered out of the chamber. And that was shortly after 2 p.m. And Senator Tuberville specifically said that he told the president, Mr. President, they just took the vice president out. I've got to go. And that was shortly after 2 p.m. There were still hours of chaos and carnage and mayhem. The vice president and his family were still in danger at that point. Our commander-in-chief did nothing.
Counsel for the former president.
The answer is no. At no point was the president informed the vice president was in any danger, because the House rushed through this impeachment in 7 days with no evidence. There is nothing at all in the record on this point, because the House failed to do even a minimum amount of due diligence. What the president did know is that there was a violent riot happening at the Capitol. That's why he repeatedly called via tweet and via video for the riots to stop, to be peaceful, to respect Capitol Police and law enforcement, and to commit no violence, and to go home. But to be clear, this is an article of impeachment for incitement. This is not an article of impeachment for anything else. It's a one count. They could have charged anything they wanted. They chose to charge incitement. So that the question, although answered directly no, it's not really relevant to the charges for the impeachment in this case. And I just wanted to clear up one more thing. Mr. Castro, in his first answer, may have spoke, but what he said was Mr. Trump had said, fight to the death. That's false. I'm hoping he misspoke. Thank you.
Mr. President.
And the questions from senators will continue. Today, we heard Trump's lawyers deny that there was an insurrection at the Capitol, and they called the charge that he incited the riot a preposterous and monstrous lie. The impeachment managers repeated the charge that the former president must be convicted because he is singularly responsible, and that his fiery rhetoric was the match that lit the flame. Stunningly, 2 Republican senators asked his defense team when Trump learned of the riot and what he did to stop it, and they had no answer. The Senate could render its verdict as soon as tomorrow on whether Mr. Trump incited the insurrection. We want to thank the entire CBS News team and let you know that our coverage is going to continue now on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can also watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app. There will be more on your local news station, on this CBS station, and there's going to be a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. So in case you missed part of it, we'll have a full wrap-up tonight. That's at 6:30 Eastern Time. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell, CBS News, Washington.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.